There are places in medieval Europe where time does not flow forward, but bleeds slowly into the stones. Hidden behind the markets, the churches, and the bustling freedom of everyday life stood the structures that held the unwanted, the condemned, the forgotten. These prisons, massive cold fortresses of stone and iron, were shadows cast across entire communities, reminders that authority never slept, and mercy rarely entered. To step inside one was to step out of the world. The air shifted, the light dimmed, the weight of centuries pressed downward in a silence broken only by the movement of guards or the restless shifting of chained bodies. These walls saw more fear than battlefields, more hunger than failed harvests, more prayers than cathedrals. They were made not to rehabilitate, but to contain, to punish, and sometimes simply to erase. A medieval prison was never just a building. It was an ecosystem of power and desperation, where wardens controlled every breath of life, within where prisoners clung to scraps of warmth and humanity, and where dawn offered no comfort. For those trapped behind the iron bars of London's Newgate Copenhagen Castle, or the fortress prisons of France and the Low Countries, each day unfolded like a relentless ritual. Some survived by luck, others endured by sheer stubbornness. Many were broken long before their judgment ever arrived. In this long-form journey, we follow a single day, as it truly might have been. The mist-drenched morning, the cold inspections, the cramped cells that swallowed identities, the cruel labor, the whispered alliances, the interrogations that bent truth itself. As dusk falls and night sinks into the stone, you will come to understand why so many medieval prisoners feared sleep even more than waking. This is not a tale of heroes or villains, but a world built from records, chronicles, court documents, archaeology, and the grim architecture still standing across Europe today. Every moment you are about to hear traces its roots to how medieval justice actually functioned. Slow, harsh, deeply human, and often unforgiving. If you enjoy cinematic journeys into the darker corners of history, remember to like, share, and subscribe, for there are countless stories from the past waiting to be uncovered. Now, step closer. The gate is opening. The mist is rising. The prison waits. A new day begins. Morning in a medieval prison did not begin with sunlight, for sunlight rarely touched the stones within. It began, instead, with a dim, colorless glow slipping over rooftops and creeping down into the alleys where these fortresses stood. In many towns across England, France, or the northern kingdoms, prisons were built like tumors, attached to the sides of castles or fortified keeps, heavy, dense, and without ornament. Their very presence signaled the boundary between freedom and the long descent into confinement. At dawn, fog gathered around the base of the outer walls, coiling like an unwilling guard. Dew clung to the iron hinges and bars, forming thin beads that slid down the metal in slow trails. The structure itself seemed to breathe coldness, its stones pulling the warmth out of the morning air. Crows perched along the battlements above their silhouettes, unmoving, as if they too waited for the day's first stirring. Near the entrance, known by everyone simply as the Iron Gate, the world felt suspended. The ground here was worn flat by carts' shackled boots and the steady patrol of those who enforced authority. The gate stood twice the height of a man, reinforced with horizontal and diagonal bands of metal so thick that no humble tool could hope to pierce them. Medieval prisons depended on the story of their strength as much as the iron itself. The gate was meant to intimidate long before it was meant to secure. Even from the outside, there was a difference in the air. Travelers who passed by on early roads often felt the chill rising from the walls, an almost unnatural dampness that didn't match the weather. It was the smell, moist stone, stale straw, and a hint of rot that seeped through cracks and crevices carried by the restless breeze. For townspeople, this odor became familiar, so much a part of daily life that they rarely acknowledged it. But for anyone new to the area, that scent told a complete story. Here was a place where breath struggled, where disease lingered, where time did not forgive. Inside, the corridors were still dark, holding the last remnants of night like a cavern. Torches had burned low during the late hours, leaving more smoke than flame in their wake. The walls were rough and uneven, shaped centuries ago by builders who valued function far more than comfort. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, steady intervals, carving tiny hollows into the floor after years of repetition. This constant moisture was the great enemy of medieval prisons, yet it was also their defining characteristic. It slid through cracks, softened wood, rusted iron, and nurtured the fungi that grew like pale scars across the stone. Beneath everything lay the faint hum of the place, the accumulated breath of generations who had passed through. A prison could hold dozens or sometimes hundreds, but even when empty, the silence was never complete. A faint echo lingered in the chambers, returning the memory of footsteps and weary exhalations. Medieval chroniclers often described these spaces as alive, not in a mystical sense, but because those within them left imprints on the environment. The stones seemed to remember suffering long after the individuals were gone. As morning approached, the first signs of life stirred behind the iron gate. Chains shifted. Wood creaked under changing temperature. Somewhere deep in the interior, a bucket fell over its water, mixing into the dirt. These were not deliberate movements, but the natural rearrangement of a neglected ecosystem. Medieval prisons were not engineered with precision. They were patched, expanded, repaired, and repurposed across decades. Their architecture formed a tangle of hallways, hidden niches, blind corners, and stairways that seemed to go nowhere. It was easy to imagine such a place developing a pulse of its own. Soon, the gatekeeper approached from the guards' quarters, his silhouette appearing in the dim corridor. Though each prison had its own staff roles, like gatekeeper, warden, and turnkey, were common across Europe. These men rarely held noble status. Their authority came from employment, not lineage. Yet here within these walls, their decisions shaped destinies as surely as any judge or sheriff. The gatekeeper carried the ring of keys that clinked against his belt, a sound that to prisoners became synonymous with dread or possibility. He paused before the iron gate, inspecting its bolts and the thick wooden beam that barred it during the night. Routine demanded this. Medieval prisons experienced constant wear, and a loose hinge or failing lock could decide the fate of everyone inside. The gatekeeper's touch was practiced running over iron, warmed slightly by the torch beside him. He understood the weaknesses of these structures, much like a sailor understands every groan of his ship. Responsibility, not empathy, guided his inspection. Outside, the light grew marginally brighter, though it had not yet pierced the morning fog. In many European towns, marketplaces stood only a street away from these walls. Merchants were beginning to set up stalls, preparing bread, cloth fish, and pottery for sale. Their voices, though faint, drifted through the narrow alleys and seeped into the stones. This contrast, the life of the town awakening while the prison remained frozen in eternal shadow, was one of the great ironies of medieval urban life. Freedom and captivity often existed side by side. Back at the entrance, the gatekeeper reached for the bar and lifted it slowly. The wood groaned under its own weight, scraping against the grooves dug deep from years of repeated movement. Once it was removed, he slid several iron bolts aside, each one releasing with a tiny shudder. He pressed his shoulder against the door and pushed. The iron gate swung open with deliberate heaviness, disturbed from its night-long stillness. Cold air rushed inward, meeting the stale breath of the interior. This moment, the opening of the gate, would set the day in motion. It was the signal for guards to begin their patrols, for prisoners to brace themselves, and for the quiet dread of night to shift into the harsher clarity of day. Light, soft and diffused, spilled onto the threshold, revealing dust motes suspended in the air. They glimmered briefly before dissolving into the surrounding gloom. Beyond the entrance lay the main corridor, stretching forward like the throat of some vast creature. The gatekeeper stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The lock clattered once, sealing the world outside from everything within. The day had begun, though dawn had barely touched the sky. And for those living behind the walls, the slow grind of another cycle, another test of endurance, was only just beginning. As the iron gate settled back into place, the weight of it reverberated through the corridor, sending a faint tremor down the stones. The prison was awake now, not suddenly, but in the slow, reluctant way a beast roused from uneasy sleep. The gatekeeper's footsteps echoed as he moved further into the main passage, a path carved by countless guards before him. These early patrols were as predictable as the sun's rising, part ritual, part necessity. Within these walls, predictability was the closest thing to safety. The corridor ahead twisted slightly, following the irregular shape of the fortress it had been built into. Medieval prisons rarely followed clean architectural lines. They grew around existing structures, each generation adding rooms according to need rather than design. Some additions had been stables in a previous century, others repurposed storerooms or abandoned guard towers. In certain corners, the floors sloped noticeably, as if the building itself had sagged under the burden of its history. Moisture clung to everything here. The stones glistened with damp patches that never fully dried no matter the season. Mold formed in pale streaks along the lower walls, feeding on the unending supply of humidity. In narrow places, where air hardly moved, a sour, almost metallic smell emanated from the ground. The people who tended the prison accepted these conditions as unchangeable. Even wealthy kingdoms rarely invested resources in improving a space designed only for the forgotten. Deeper inside, the air grew colder. The structures overhead blocked nearly all natural light, and torches were placed sparingly, more to mark the guards' routes than to offer illumination. The flicker of each flame cast wavering patterns on the walls, turning cracks into shifting shadows and water stains into abstract shapes. These shadows seemed to move even when the air was still, giving the impression that unseen presences followed those who walked the corridors. The gatekeeper's path eventually narrowed into a small atrium where the walls opened out in a vaulted arch. This was one of the oldest parts of the prison, originally built as an interior courtyard centuries earlier. Now, the roof was sealed with thick planks reinforced by stone, leaving only a small grate high above that allowed a thin trickle of fresh air to seep through. Dust drifted in delicate strands from that distant opening, catching faint glimmers of torchlight as they fell. Here, the first signs of human presence emerged. Discarded straw, a broken sandal strap, a crude wooden bowl left near a bucket of cloudy water. These were remnants of the night shift, when guards struggled to maintain vigilance through the long hours. Medieval prisons were not always fully staffed. Many relied on only a handful of men to oversee large numbers of inmates. Fatigue shaped every aspect of their work, from missed inspections to harsh decisions made in irritation rather than judgment. Behind the atrium, a narrow passage wound deeper toward the main cell block. As the gatekeeper approached, the smell intensified the sour mixture of sweat, refuse, damp wool, and the unmistakable odor of humans who had been confined too long without adequate washing. Medieval sanitation was limited even outside these walls, and inside it became nearly non-existent. Water was rationed both for prisoners and guards, and cleanliness was not a priority in a place where the expectation of disease was constant. The cell block itself remained silent for the moment, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the quiet of exhaustion. Most prisoners endured restless nights, waking repeatedly from nightmares or discomfort. Some were bound by chains that prevented them from rolling onto their sides. Others slept on beds of straw mixed with vermin. The lucky ones had wooden platforms, though the boards were often warped or splintered. Mourning for them brought no relief. It only announced the beginning of another day indistinguishable from the last. Before stepping into the cell block, the gatekeeper paused at a stone basin filled with water from the nearby well. He dipped his hands into the icy liquid, letting the cold bite into his fingers before wiping them dry on his tunic. This simple act served a purpose beyond habit. Prisons were breeding grounds for illness, and guards learned sometimes too late that even brief contact with certain prisoners could spread infection. Rinsing was not an effective barrier by modern standards, but in this setting, it was one of the few measures available. When he entered the doorway into the cell block, the gloom deepened. Rows of iron bars stretched into the shadows, each set marking the boundary of a cramped chamber. The cells varied in size, some barely large enough for a man to stand upright, others slightly more spacious, but still oppressive. The walls between them were uneven, patched with different types of stone, as if built by different hands across multiple eras. In the nearest cell, a figure stirred. The faint movement drew the gatekeeper's attention, though he expected it. Prisoners often woke when the first footsteps passed their doors, conditioned by long months of survival within these walls. The figure shifted again, curling deeper beneath a thin blanket. Even in sleep, many protected themselves instinctively from the cold air that seeped through the bars. This early hour was the only time when the prison seemed suspended between stillness and chaos. Soon the warden would arrive. Then the guards would begin their routine inspections, and the delicate quiet would vanish. But for now, the building existed in a fragile, eerie calm. The morning fog outside, unable to penetrate the interior, pressed against the stones from the other side, as if trying to reclaim the space from the men who built it. The gatekeeper continued onward, passing each cell with a quick, practiced glance. He noted which torches needed replacing, which locks stuck, which patches of straw would need clearing. The subtle rhythms of his work reflected a truth often overlooked in tales of medieval prisons. Despite the harshness, neglect, and brutality of these institutions, they still depended on the daily labor of ordinary people who had grown accustomed to maintaining environments that most others feared. As he reached the end of the row, he paused again. Ahead lay another heavy door, smaller than the iron gate, but equally fortified. This one separated the main cell block from the deeper interior where the most dangerous or politically inconvenient prisoners were kept. Few ventured into that sector at this hour, and even fewer did so willingly. But the morning required certain actions, and routines had to be observed. The gatekeeper reached for his keys once more, their metal cold against his hand. The day inside the prison was now fully underway, though the sun had barely risen beyond the fog. Life here followed its own rhythm, slow, heavy, and indifferent to the world outside. And as the first hour passed, the true face of the prison began to reveal itself, one stone and shadow at a time. The warden began his morning round as the pale light outside struggled to push its way through the slits in the stone walls. His steps were measured, deliberate, and heavy enough that every bootfall seemed to settle into the building's bones. He moved with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to authority in a place where authority was enforced not by written rule, but by presence alone. The corridors ahead of him remained dim, still holding the remnants of the night's cold. Torches burned low, their glow more ember than flame, casting long, trembling shadows that clung to the uneven stones. He carried no lantern. He had walked these halls long enough to know every dip and rise of the floor, every cracked stone, every iron hinge that caught just slightly on its frame. The prison to him was not a collection of rooms, but a single organism, a creature of stone, iron, and suffering whose pulse he could feel as clearly as his own. As he made his way forward, the faint warmth from the outer world gave way once more to the persistent chill inside, a reminder that this place existed apart from the rhythms of ordinary life. Dust floated in the air, where the torchlight managed to reach, drifting lazily untouched by wind. The warden passed beneath the oldest arch of the main corridor, its stones worn smooth by centuries of damp air and human movement. This arch marked not just a change in the architecture, but in the atmosphere itself. Beyond it lay the true heart of the prison, a section where the air thickened with a scent that defied easy description, something between stale rot and the metallic tang of rust. It was a smell that clung to anyone who passed through, long enough settling into their clothes, their hair, even the lines of their hands. He paused for a moment, not out of hesitation, but ritual, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper dark. It was during this pause that the prisoners closest to his route first sensed his presence. They sensed him before they saw him, the way animals sense the approach of something that sits above them in the hierarchy of danger. Their bodies tensed, shoulders tightening, eyes sharpening. In the dimness, expressions flickered: fear, resentment, resignation, each revealed only for a heartbeat before the prisoners returned to the stillness they had learned to adopt whenever authority drifted near. As he resumed his walk, the sound of distant chains shifted ever so slightly, as though their owners were trying to remain unnoticed. The warden expected no rebellion, not at this hour, not in this section, yet the subtle shift in the prisoner's stillness told him all he needed to know. They remembered what could happen if order fractured. They remembered what happened the last time a man thought the bars were merely an inconvenience. Stories lingered in places like these far longer than the people who lived them. The walls retained them, holding them like cold breath trapped in winter air. The warden reached the first set of cells on his route. The bars here were thick, older than many of the families in the surrounding town, and darkened not just by age, but by the oil and grime of countless hands. Through these bars, faint shapes moved, men rising slightly from their straw, others drawing into themselves to avoid unwanted attention. The warden observed them without breaking stride. His gaze skimmed across each cell, never lingering too long on any single face, yet taking in everything: posture, injuries, signs of sleeplessness, hints of sickness. He was not a doctor, but he could recognize weakness with precision. Weakness could spread. Weakness led to desperation. And desperation didn't stay confined to a single cell. A faint draft swept along the corridor, stirring the torches and causing shadows to shiver against the walls. The warden continued forward, passing cells where the oldest inmates kept their heads bowed, conserving their strength for a day that offered little to preserve. Some had been here for seasons, others for years, and a few for spans of time, long enough that the world outside its wars, its kings, its changing boundaries had become more rumor than memory. Those men rarely looked directly at the warden. They stared at the ground or the stone opposite their bars, their minds somewhere deeper, in a place where time had lost its shape. Younger prisoners watched him more carefully. Their eyes followed him like shuttered windows, cracking open just enough to observe the weather. Their chests rose and fell sharply in the cold air, their bodies still fighting the instinct to resist their confinement. The warden knew their type men whose anger had not yet cooled into numbness. These were the ones who sometimes tested the limits. They were not ready to accept the rhythm of captivity, not ready to surrender fully to the stone. Their presence required vigilance. He reached a junction where two corridors met. One stretched toward the lower levels, where the deeper cells lay close to the earth, damp and almost forgotten. The other led toward the more administrative side of the prison storage rooms, the chamber where the day's records would eventually be tallied, and the small alcove used for preparing the sparse rations. To the prisoners, this fork represented a distinction between two worlds, where punishment hardened and where routine settled into plain monotony. To the warden, the distinction mattered little. Both sides required oversight. Both contained their own dangers if left unattended. He turned toward the deeper levels first. His route always began here. The worst spaces demanded the earliest attention, not out of cruelty, but practicality. The men confined in the lower cells were often the most fragile or the most unpredictable. Some were awaiting judgment, others had already received it, and a few had simply vanished into the system names recorded, once then left to fade like ink exposed to damp. The stairs descended more steeply than was necessary, the steps worn smooth in their centers where countless boots had traveled before. Moisture collected on the edges, glistening faintly in the dim torchlight. The warden moved steadily unaffected by the chill rising from below. The deeper he went, the less human the air felt. It became heavier, as though the stone held its breath around him. At the bottom of the stairs, the corridor opened into a space where the ceiling hung lower and the walls closed in. Here, the cells were fewer, but more oppressive. Chains hung directly from the walls, instead of from fixed fixtures, and the straw was thinner, often damp, from the seepage that crept through the stone. The warden studied these cells with even greater care, scanning for any sign that the night had taken more from the inmates than their sleep. The men here watched him differently, not with anger, nor with open fear, but with a kind of depleted resignation. Their eyes followed him, because there was little else to look at. A faint flicker of torchlight caught the metal of a chain, revealing the raw skin of a man who had rubbed against it during the night. The warden noted it silently, not with sympathy, but with calculation. Wounds could fester. Infection could spread. If disease rooted itself in these lower cells, it could claim more than just the weak. It could destabilize the fragile equilibrium that held the prison together. He made a mental note to have the man moved closer to the stairs if his condition worsened. He continued his slow advance, observing the subtle shifts in the prisoner's expressions as he passed. Some eyes closed reflexively, as if by shutting out the world, they could make themselves less noticeable. Others widened, trying to interpret the meaning of each small gesture he made. In this place, where routine governed survival, even the slightest deviation could send ripples of unease down the corridors. By the time he turned back toward the upper levels, the torches behind him looked like fading stars, suspended in a darkness that seemed deeper than mere shadow. The warden ascended with the same steady pace. He had descended his boots, carrying the memory of the lower cells with them. He emerged once more into the main corridor, where the air felt marginally lighter, though no warmer. His morning inspection was far from finished. He still had to make his way through the larger cell blocks, the holding chambers, and the outer walkways, where the boundary between confinement and the world beyond felt thinnest. But for now, after the first portion of his route, the prison had awakened fully. And so had its fears. The warden continues his deliberate march, the leather of his boots brushing against drifts of straw scattered along the passageway. Behind him, torches flicker in a loose rhythm, as if trying to keep time with his steps. Warmth never settles here. Even fire seems hesitant, wavering in the cold draft that creeps under the stones. As he approaches the lower tier of cells, a sharp metallic scent fills the air. Not blood, not exactly, but the long embedded echo of it. Old stains in the cracks of the stone hint at fights settled without intervention or punishments carried out without ceremony. Every mark tells a story no one dares to retell. He stops at the first cell and lifts the iron latch just enough to test its resistance. A dull clank answers him. The prisoner inside shifts slightly, though he never raises his eyes. It is not defiance. It is surrender. A kind of obedience born from too many mornings like this one. The warden watches him for a moment, long enough to remind the man that he is seen, but not long enough to offer anything that resembles humanity. With a sharp drop of the latch, he moves on. Each inspection is performed with the same methodical precision. He counts not out loud, but in the hardened rhythm of his mind. 1 cell, 2, 3, 1 broken hinge repaired the previous week, 1 loose stone to report later, 1 prisoner showing signs of fever. He will mark that silently, not out of concern, but out of necessity. Disease spreads quickly here, and outbreaks complicate the records. A dead prisoner cannot be interrogated. A dying one cannot perform labor. Even the warden's harshness has boundaries defined by the bureaucracy above him. He pauses at a cell where 2 men are chained to opposite walls. They do not speak. They rarely do when he is near. But he senses the tension that lives between them, something bred from arguments whispered the night before, or from power struggles conducted through gestures rather than words. The warden understands these currents instinctively. A stable prison requires a delicate, silent balance. Rivalries keep men sharp, but not reckless. Alliances give them the illusion of control without granting actual power. His job is to preserve that balance not through diplomacy, but through calculated neglect and timely reminders of authority. He continues his silent surveillance, inspecting the iron rings embedded in the stones. Some were placed generations earlier, blackened by soot and age. Others are newer, hammered in with less skill, commissioned hastily when another influx of prisoners arrived after the last harvest. The prison evolves with the world outside it, even if the prisoners do not. Laws change. Accusations shift. But the walls absorb each generation the same way, indifferently. As he turns a corner, the corridor narrows. A damp haze clings to the stones here, and the floor slopes slightly toward a drainage channel carved centuries earlier. The warden steps over it without looking. He has walked this path longer than many prisoners have been alive. He knows every uneven stone, every draft, every echo of every hallway. The prison is not merely his workplace. It is his domain, a sealed world that obeys only his order. At the end of this narrower passage stands a heavy door bound by iron straps. Behind it lies a chamber reserved for isolation, not punishment. Exactly. But a place where prisoners disappear temporarily from the simmering tensions of the general cells. The warden unlocks the door, but does not step inside. He listens. Silence, the kind that feels thicker than darkness. He closes the door again, satisfied. A night spent alone in that room strips a man of his certainty. It does not injure him. It simply empties him. And an empty prisoner is easier to manage. Back in the broader corridor, the warden begins a more detailed inspection of the walls. Moisture seeps through several stones, leaving long, dark streaks that stretch like skeletal fingers toward the floor. In one place, a small puddle has formed near the edge of a cell door. He kneels just long enough to press his glove against the moisture, assessing the leak. It will worsen unless repaired. Not because he cares for the condition of the prisoners, but because weakened walls invite collapse, and collapse invites inquiry. Inquiry invites trouble. Better to address the problem before anyone above him notices. He rises and wipes the moisture from his glove, leaving a faint smudge across the leather. The torchlight catches his face as he turns, revealing lines etched deep into his brow. Responsibility weighs differently on him than on other men. For many, responsibility means duty. For him, it means control, absolute, orderly, unquestioned control. Without it, the prison would devour itself. The sound of a chain scraping the floor pulls his attention to another cell. The prisoner inside shifts restlessly, unable to sleep, unable to find comfort in the restraints. The warden watches him with a long, unmoving gaze. The man senses it and freezes. There is no threat in the warden's expression, no flare of anger or cruelty, only an unwavering expectation that the prisoner will correct himself without instruction. The moment stretches, then breaks. The prisoner lowers his head, order restored. Satisfied, the warden resumes his walk. His shadow follows him faithfully, stretching and shrinking with every flicker of the torches. In the dim light, he resembles not a man, but a specter moving through a realm built of stone and suffering. Yet there is no malice in him, no enjoyment, only the relentless discipline of a man shaped by a system that values obedience above compassion. He reaches the end of his route, where a small wooden desk sits beneath an alcove. On the desk rests a ledger, thick with years of entries. He opens it to a blank space and begins recording his morning observations. His handwriting is sharp and orderly. One prisoner ill, one hinge weakened, one stone leaking, one conflict brewing between two chained men. Each detail is transcribed without emotion, as though he were documenting weather patterns rather than human lives. When he closes the ledger, the weight of the book echoes through the corridor, a sound that signals the end of the warden's morning watch. He stands, surveys the hallway once more, and nods to himself. The prison has survived another night. Order remains intact. The stone corridors stretched like endless veins through the heart of the fortress, cold and unyielding. Each step echoed against the damp walls, a hollow reminder of the prisoner's confinement. Torchlight flickered weakly along the passages, casting long, distorted shadows that danced over rough-hewn stone. In the morning haze of dust and dampness, the smell of mildew, unwashed bodies, and stale straw hung thick in the air, curling into every crevice of the prison. Here, time did not flow as it did in the world beyond the walls. It was an endless, oppressive loop of darkness and waiting. Cells came in many forms, though none offered comfort. Some were narrow cubicles, barely wide enough for a man to lie flat. The cold stone pressed against them from all sides, leaching heat from their bodies with each passing hour. Others were mere chambers for multiple captives, their occupants pressed together, like cargo in a hold, each breath mingling with the next in a humid, stale cloud. The floors were uneven, often layered with rotting straw intended as bedding, but more commonly a breeding ground for lice and vermin. Rats scurried between legs, teeth gnashing, eyes glinting in the dim light. A single misstep could mean a bite, a disease, or the accidental crushing of a mouse underfoot, each outcome greeted with weary indifference. Iron rings and chains hung from walls and floors. Some prisoners were bound to them for weeks at a time, the chill of the metal sinking into flesh, leaving marks that would not fade for months. The clang of chains from neighboring cells echoed down the hall, a metallic chorus of suffering that became as familiar as the cold stones themselves. Men cursed under their breath, spat, and sometimes wept quietly, though the sound was often swallowed by the oppressive silence. Each sigh, each muttered word carried weight, a small rebellion against the suffocating solitude. Light was scarce and fickle. Narrow windows, often barred and placed high, allowed only slivers of gray daylight to penetrate the gloom. In winter, even these were little more than illusions, as snow and frost blocked the already scant sun. In summer, the same openings let in searing heat during the day, making the stones themselves unbearable to touch, while at night the cold returned with relentless force. There was no comfort in the cycles of the sun. The prison remained a world apart, indifferent to seasons, indifferent to life. Prisoners marked the passing hours not by clocks which were non-existent, but by the arrival and departure of guards, the meager meals tossed into their cells, or the sound of new captives being dragged along the corridors. Hygiene was a distant concept. Urine and excrement pooled in corners or overflowed from crude privies, permeating the air with a pungency that clung stubbornly to hair clothes and skin. Illness traveled quickly here. Dysentery, typhoid, and other maladies spread through contact, shared water, and contaminated straw. Even the strongest constitution could falter under the combined strain of hunger, filth, and fatigue. Some prisoners succumbed in silence. Others cried out, though their deaths often passed unnoticed, except by those who shared their chains. The boundaries between life and decay blurred. Despite the hardships, prisoners adapted in small ways. Men learned to coil themselves into corners, to conserve warmth, to cover sores with strips of cloth or moss to hide the marks of disease, and to share meager bits of bread without inviting theft or violence. Hierarchies emerged within cells. Older or stronger men often commanded respect, whether by brute strength or the wisdom of surviving the previous days. Younger or weaker prisoners learned to navigate these micro-societies with caution, offering labor or compliance in exchange for protection or scraps of food. The cell became a miniature society, governed by rules unwritten but strictly enforced. Trust was a rare commodity, and betrayal could cost a man his life. Isolation was the silent tormentor. Even in cells with multiple occupants, each man or woman faced stretches of solitude, moments when no human voice reached their ears. Thoughts became both companion and enemy. Memories of family, home, or freedom haunted them, sometimes comforting, sometimes sharpening the pang of loss. Madness was a real and ever-present threat. Some prisoners murmured to themselves, tracing imagined patterns on the walls, speaking to the rats or to phantoms conjured by hunger and fever. Others fell into near catatonic silence, staring at the same stone for hours, the mind withdrawing from a world that offered nothing but suffering. Yet the darkness was not absolute. Prisoners found small moments of humanity in the squalor. A whispered word in the night, the sharing of a straw mat, or the careful rationing of a moldy piece of bread forged connections. Stories were exchanged quietly, memories of the outside world trading hands as a form of currency. These moments became lifelines, threads of light that pierced the oppressive gloom, however fleeting. A song hummed softly beneath breath, a prayer whispered to unseen gods, or a sketch scratched into the wall with a nail, became acts of defiance against the consuming despair. The architecture itself seemed to enforce despair. Heavy wooden doors, bound with iron ceilings, low enough to force hunched posture walls so thick that the faintest sound from outside, the barking of a dog, the clang of the drawbridge, was swallowed before reaching the prisoner's ears. Guards moved methodically, rarely speaking, but their presence was a constant reminder of authority and control. Any misstep, any attempt at resistance was swiftly and often brutally punished. Fear existed in multiple layers. Fear of the environment, fear of the body's weakening, and fear of those who wielded power within these walls. In these cells, stories converged silently. A noble imprisoned for debts, a thief caught in the market, a political dissident detained without trial, all shared the same cold stone, the same bitter air, the same hunger that gnawed day and night. Their individuality was simultaneously erased and magnified by their circumstances. Survival required more than endurance. It demanded attention to the smallest detail, from the way one positioned oneself to avoid lice bites, to how one rationed scraps of food, to whether one caught the guard's glance or avoided it entirely. Each decision carried weight, shaping the fragile balance between life and death. As the day progressed, the dim light from the narrow windows shifted slightly, but the change was negligible to the prisoners. It was a reminder that the world beyond the walls moved on indifferent to their suffering. Inside, shadows lengthened and retreated. With the passing hours, the torches sputtered and flared, and the stone absorbed the echoes of whispered prayers, curses, and muttered despair. These walls, though silent and cold, held the collective memory of all who had passed through, etching their presence into every crack and seam. By the evening, the first shivers of night began to creep into the cells. Prisoners drew together for warmth, where possible, though personal space was a rare luxury. Some clasped their knees, shivering under threadbare garments, while others leaned against walls, eyes closed, waiting for sleep that often did not come. In the darkness, they listened to one another. The rasp of breath, the occasional cough, the distant clang of chains, and found a strange rhythm, a pattern to their suffering that offered both terror and strange comfort. Survival depended on observation, adaptation, and resilience, each man or woman learning the limits of endurance within the unforgiving embrace of stone and shadow. This was the reality of life in the cells of a medieval prison, a world where light was scarce airfowl and hope a fragile flickering flame. Here every sensation was magnified by confinement, every movement, every breath, every glance carried significance. Within these walls, the prisoners' bodies and minds were tested in ways the free could scarcely imagine. As night deepened, the prison's oppressive quiet became a living presence. Shadows pooled in the corners of the cells, blacker than any cloth, moving as if alive with the memories and fears of every soul confined there. Prisoners pressed themselves against the cold stone walls, seeking warmth that the masonry refused to offer. Their eyes, adjusted to the dim torchlight, flicked nervously toward every sound: the distant shuffle of a guard's boots, the hollow drip of water echoing through tunnels, the faint scratching of rats in the straw. Every noise was a reminder that the world outside carried on without them, unconcerned with their suffering. Some attempted to create small rituals of comfort, gestures to affirm their humanity against the crushing weight of isolation. One man meticulously rearranged the tattered straw on the floor into a semblance of bedding, smoothing down the edges, as if asserting control over at least this tiny part of his environment. Another traced figures in the dust, a fleeting landscape of home and hearth that would disappear with the next gust of wind or disturbance. A woman hummed a low, almost imperceptible tune, a fragment of a lullaby her mother once sang, and the notes, though faint, were a defiance of the silence that sought to consume her. These acts, though small, were anchors in the storm, tenuous threads of sanity in a world designed to strip it away. Conversations whispered behind cupped hands or walls formed the lifeblood of the cell community. Knowledge was currency. The older prisoners, weathered by countless days and nights, shared survival strategies with newcomers, how to avoid frostbite in winter, how to soften the sting of lice, how to stretch a morsel of bread to last a day. Secrets of human ingenuity emerged in hushed tones. Someone might reveal that a broken shard of pottery could serve as a cutting tool, or that damp straw layered just so could provide insulation. These shared insights created bonds fragile as they were in a place built to crush the human spirit. Disease, however, was an unyielding force. The stench of sickness permeated the cells, a bitter reminder that no skill or cunning could fully protect one from the ravages of the body under constant stress. Fevers rose quickly, chills followed, and the cries of the afflicted filled the halls with a haunting cadence. Prisoners learned to tread carefully, to avoid contact when possible, to minimize risk. Yet in the tight confines, avoidance was often impossible. A cough or a sneeze could ripple through the cell like wildfire, leaving despair in its wake. Even those who survived faced lingering weakness, the body slowly eroded by hunger, filth, and exposure. Within this darkness, tension simmered. Proximity and confinement turned minor irritations into potential violence. Arguments over food scraps or straw often escalated, sometimes into blows. The cell became a crucible in which patience and cunning were tested alongside physical endurance. Yet moments of solidarity also arose. A stronger prisoner might shield a weaker one from the brunt of a guard's fury, or a group might quietly share a portion of bread, each bite symbolizing more than sustenance. It was survival and empathy intertwined. In these moments, the prisoner's humanity shone brightest, fragile, yet unmistakable, a quiet rebellion against the dehumanizing intent of the walls around them. The architecture itself seemed to conspire with despair. Heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron, clanged shut, with finality sealing hope behind bars. Narrow windows, slit-like and high above, allowed only slivers of moonlight to puncture the gloom. The ceiling, low in some cells, forced prisoners to hunch, shortening their bodies as if to fit the space, compressing the spine and the spirit alike. Stone floors were unforgiving, leaving bruises and sores from prolonged rest in one position. Even the air conspired against them, damp and cold, thick with the mingled odors of human excretion, sweat, and disease. Every breath was a challenge, every movement an exercise in caution. Yet within these confines, small victories offered reprieve. A prisoner might fashion a needle from a splinter of wood and mend torn clothing, preserving dignity in an environment designed to strip it away. Another might quietly communicate with a cellmate through cracks in the wall, sharing intelligence about guard rotations or new arrivals. These acts, though minor, were acts of resistance, affirmations that they had not yet surrendered to the stone and darkness. The human mind, in all its resilience, sought meaning and mastery wherever possible, even in the bleakest conditions. Sleep, when it came, was fitful. Men and women huddled against walls, shivering often, waking in the middle of the night to the cold or the sudden noise of a guard's inspection. Dreams were rare, replaced by the relentless awareness of the body's vulnerability and the omnipresent threat of pain, illness, or death. The night stretched heavy and interminable, and with it, the psychological weight grew. Loneliness, fear, and anticipation became tangible companions, coiling in the corners like the rats that scurried unnoticed over feet and hands. Yet the body's need for rest was stronger than the mind's fear, and eventually, even the most alert and fearful succumbed to brief intervals of unconsciousness. The prisoners learned to navigate these nights with strategies both cunning and practical. Some whispered prayers, calling upon saints or deities they barely remembered, seeking protection or deliverance. Others focused on counting or breathing, inventing internal rituals to maintain a semblance of control over thoughts and fears. A careful shift of position, to preserve warmth. A subtle exchange of gestures with a neighbor, even a shared hum or muttered story, became part of a nightly choreography that allowed survival through the darkness. These small acts, though imperceptible to the outside world, were profound assertions of agency in a space designed to remove all autonomy. By dawn, the prison's darkness began to relent slightly, though the relief was minimal. The faintest light crept through the narrow windows, brushing the stone with pale gray. Prisoners, stiff and sore from the night, stirred. Some greeted the new day with relief, others with apprehension. Hunger returned with renewed insistence alongside the aches and the sicknesses that had not abated. The cells, unchanged and unyielding, awaited the prisoners' next movements. Yet even in this monotony, survival had been claimed once more, a testament to endurance, resilience, and the fragile yet persistent human spirit. The cells of the medieval prison were a crucible where mind and body were relentlessly tested. They imposed isolation, discomfort, and despair. Yet within their stone embrace, the prisoners' resourcefulness, adaptability, and humanity flickered stubbornly, refusing to be extinguished. Every breath, every gesture, every shared secret or small act of cunning was a thread in the tapestry of endurance. In these dark, narrow spaces, life was reduced to its essence, survival connection, and the quiet assertion that even in confinement, one could remain defiantly, stubbornly human. As the day's first activities resumed, the clang of keys, the shuffle of boots, the occasional shout, the prisoners settled into the rhythm they had mastered. The cells were not merely spaces of confinement. They were arenas of endurance, microcosms of human resilience tested against the unyielding force of stone iron and isolation. And as the light shifted, as the echoes of the prison carried on through the labyrinthine corridors, it was clear that within the darkness, life, though battered and constrained, persisted. Morning arrived slowly in the prison, not with the warmth of sunlight spilling through open windows, but as a pale, hesitant light filtering through narrow slits in the thick stone walls. The day began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as prisoners stirred from restless sleep. Muscles, stiff backs, sore from the unyielding stone floors, and the scant straw that served as bedding. Some groaned, others sat silently, eyes fixed on the shadows that stretched and receded across the cell, as if mocking their confinement. Each movement was deliberate, measured, for even the smallest sound could draw the attention of a guard, or worse, the ire of fellow prisoners. Within these walls, hierarchy existed even among captives. The older, more seasoned prisoners navigated the morning with practiced caution, offering advice in hushed tones how to ration the few morsels of food, how to position themselves to avoid the cold drafts, how to keep lice at bay without drawing notice. New arrivals, still raw with fear and confusion, watched silently, learning the unspoken rules that governed life behind bars. They quickly understood that survival was a delicate balance of caution, endurance, and subtle cunning, and that each day demanded vigilance in ways they had never imagined outside these walls. The prisoners themselves were a mosaic of medieval society. A man accused of petty theft leaned heavily on a cane, his eyes hollow with anxiety. Yet a flicker of defiance burned faintly beneath his fatigue. Beside him, a young woman, unjustly imprisoned for a dispute over land, adjusted her soiled tunic, trying to maintain what dignity she could in the face of relentless indignities. A former soldier, stripped of rank and honor, sat silently scarred, both physically and mentally, from battles fought in distant fields, now forced to endure a new kind of conflict within these confined stone walls. Each carried the weight of their past, their sins, or misfortunes, all equally powerless against the day's imposed routine. The air was thick with tension, compounded by the odors that clung to every surface: damp straw, human sweat, and the ever-present hint of decay. Rats scuttled over the floor, audacious in their search for scraps, ignoring the humans they shared the space with as if daring them to reclaim dominion. Yet the prisoners' senses were sharpened, each sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. The creak of iron hinges, the echo of distant footsteps, the muffled groan from an adjoining cell. All were catalogued, analyzed, and remembered. In this environment, even awareness became a tool of survival. Prisoners began their morning with small acts that sustained both body and spirit. Some moved to the tiny communal spaces where the minimal rations were distributed, balancing desperation with discretion. Those who had learned the art of patience avoided confrontation over scraps, quietly assessing the mood of guards and neighbors alike. Others engaged in the simplest forms of labor. The prison allowed sweeping the stone floor, tending to the meager refuse, or attempting to repair torn clothing. These tasks, though mundane, were lifelines imbuing a sense of purpose that the walls sought to strip away. Each carefully executed motion was a statement they were still living, still thinking, still asserting their humanity. As the day progressed, the prisoners' interactions revealed the intricate social fabric that had formed within the confines of the prison. Alliances were fragile, yet vital. Trust was a precious commodity, traded in whispered warnings or shared morsels of bread. Conflicts simmered beneath the surface, sometimes erupting in quick, sharp bursts, a shove, a muttered insult, a fleeting glare, but were often diffused with negotiation and silent compromise. Hierarchies emerged based on strength, wit, and the ability to manipulate the smallest advantages. In this microcosm, each prisoner navigated a constant dance of strategy and self-preservation. Health and hygiene were precarious concerns. The morning routine involved attempts, however limited, to stave off the diseases that thrived in such an environment. Some prisoners meticulously inspected their clothes and bodies for lice or sores, scraping away what they could, improvising remedies from scraps of cloth or water drawn from the foul cisterns. Others rested their heads on folded tunics, trying to shield themselves from the damp cold that seeped through stone. Every precaution was temporary, a brief reprieve in a landscape of ever-present risk, yet each act carried immense significance, a defiance of the elements and the prison itself. The prison also functioned as a stage for observation and learning. Newcomers watched the older prisoners, noting which actions provoked the guards' attention and which allowed one to move unnoticed. They learned how to interpret subtle cues: the shift of a foot, a narrowed eye, a change in the guard's tone. Knowledge of the environment, of the rules and rhythms of captivity, became as crucial as food or shelter. Those who adapted quickly gained a small but vital edge, often the difference between enduring the day with minimal suffering or falling prey to punishment and disease. Beyond survival, prisoners clung to remnants of identity and memory. Small gestures, a carved symbol on a wall, a whispered story of life before the stone walls, a song softly hummed, served as threads, connecting them to a world beyond their confinement. These acts were both personal and communal, a silent assertion that life, however constrained, persisted within the cells. Even in despair, prisoners sought to maintain these fragments, nurturing the faint hope that one day they might return to freedom, or at least leave some trace of their existence behind. The morning routine, though harsh and unforgiving, revealed the enduring complexity of human behavior under duress. The prisoners' responses, patience, cunning, solidarity, or defiance, highlighted the spectrum of strategies developed in a crucible of deprivation. Each individual's actions carried consequences, not just for themselves, but for those around them. In the narrow, cold, and unforgiving halls of the prison, the dynamics of power alliance and survival played out with relentless intensity, a daily theater of life and death. By the time the guards completed their initial inspections and the day's first labor assignments were issued, the prisoners had settled into a fragile rhythm. Awareness of the body's needs, hunger, warmth, movement, intertwined with vigilance against threats, both external and internal. Every gesture, every decision was calibrated to maintain existence in a space that rewarded neither comfort nor respite. Yet within this structure, human resilience shone subtle but undeniable. The mind trained by necessity found patterns, routines, and moments of control in an environment designed to strip them away. The prisoners' mourning, though grim, laid the foundation for endurance. They understood that each day was a test, each hour a potential hazard. Hunger, fatigue, disease, and fear were constant companions, yet within these limitations, individuals carved out spaces of autonomy, dignity, and survival. The cells, the guards, the routines, all were elements in a daily calculus of living a test of both body and spirit. And in these small victories, the management of a pain, the concealment of a secret, the preservation of a morsel prisoners quietly asserted that their humanity remained intact even within the unyielding stone. As the sun's faint light struggled through the narrow apertures, the prisoners braced for the labor interrogation and rigors the day would inevitably bring. Their mourning, though, marked by monotony and hardship, had been a rehearsal, a preparation for the relentless continuity of prison life. In this liminal space between darkness and toil, they had claimed small victories, preserved small comforts, and maintained the fragile thread of existence that would carry them through another day. The human spirit, confined but not broken, persisted in whispered strategies, quiet resilience, and the ever-present hope that endurance might someday be rewarded. As the morning deepened, the prisoners' quiet endurance evolved into subtle motion. Some shuffled toward the tiny windows, their hands tracing the cold, rough stone, feeling the faint warmth of sunlight that barely touched the damp walls. Others lingered near the threshold of their cells' ears, attuned to every sound, the faint clatter of distant chains, the soft scraping of a broom across the stone floor, the echoing footsteps of a guard pacing the corridor. Each prisoner moved deliberately, conscious that the smallest misstep could provoke punishment. A reminder that freedom was not simply absent, it was actively denied. Within this confined world, small routines became lifelines. Prisoners combed the straw bedding, extracting lice and dirt, or straightened ragged clothing to stave off the gnawing cold. Some tended the meager possessions. They were permitted a carved trinket, a small piece of bread saved from a previous meal, a scrap of cloth that offered warmth or comfort. These simple acts were infused with meaning, transforming the harshness of their confinement into a fragile sense of agency. Even the act of arranging one's straw bedding could assert a fleeting control over a space otherwise dominated by stone and iron. The human eye, deprived of wide horizons, became sharper in the prison. Observing others was both necessary and instinctive. Prisoners noted the guards' rhythms, the subtle cues that predicted moods or potential aggression. They tracked their neighbors' behavior, assessing potential allies or rivals. Trust was scarce and carefully negotiated. A misjudged word or gesture could provoke reprisal. Alliances were formed and tested often in silence, with gestures as subtle as the placement of a loaf of bread or the offering of a cloth to wipe away sweat or blood. In this microcosm, survival required more than endurance. It demanded social intelligence, intuition, and timing. Some prisoners sought to reclaim fragments of their former lives in small, almost imperceptible ways. A whispered prayer to a saint, a quiet recitation of a familiar rhyme, or the silent tracing of a memory on the wall. These acts became spiritual sustenance. They reinforced identity, providing a mental fortress against the erosion of dignity and sanity. The oldest prisoners often guided the youngest in these rituals, passing down not just practical knowledge, but also the means to endure psychologically. This blend of practical survival and mental resilience defined the contours of life within the prison walls. The morning air, though frigid and damp, carried faint scents that could betray the prison's hierarchy and conditions. Smoke from a distant fire mingled with the stench of unwashed bodies and the tang of wet stone. Some prisoners learned to navigate these olfactory cues, locating the slightly cleaner corners or identifying the nearest sources of warmth. Even in a world stripped of comfort, subtle sensory awareness offered advantages and edge that might mean fewer scuffles, less exposure to illness, or a momentary reprieve from the relentless discomfort of confinement. In the shadows of the corridor, prisoners observed the movement of the warden and guards. Each inspection was a ritual of intimidation, a reminder of the absolute authority wielded within these walls. Their approach was deliberate steps, echoing ominously against the stone, the jingle of keys, a warning, the rustle of leather and chain, a signal of power. Prisoners adapted to these rhythms, moving with careful timing, holding their breaths as the wardens passed, learning when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to feign ignorance. In these moments, survival was both physical and psychological, a constant negotiation of presence and restraint. Morning labor began in fits and starts. Prisoners were summoned to the courtyards or labor yards to haul stones, carry water, sweep floors, or clean the cesspools. The work was arduous, performed under the watchful eyes of guards who measured compliance and effort with a relentless eye. Laziness or resistance was met with immediate correction. Shouts, lashes, or the threat of extended confinement in darker cells. Each prisoner learned quickly that discretion, endurance, and silent protest were essential tools. Those who managed to blend effort with invisibility often fared better, preserving both body and spirit for the long stretch of captivity ahead. Amid these tasks, whispers continued to flow like currents beneath the surface. Plans for escape tales from beyond the walls and rumors of the outside world circulated cautiously, each carefully considered before utterance. These exchanges were fraught with danger. The wrong listener could turn confidences into punishment. Yet they provided hope, a tether to life beyond stone and iron, and a reminder that prisoners were not wholly defeated. Even in the smallest, most fleeting interactions, humanity persisted. Curiosity, solidarity, and cunning coexisting with fear and fatigue. As the morning waned, fatigue set in. Muscles ached from unnatural positions, backs stiffened, and stomachs gurgled with the persistent pangs of hunger. Prisoners returned to their cells when summoned, some lingering in corners to catch moments of warmth or silence, others retreating to the farthest reaches of their cells to avoid scrutiny. The monotony and intensity of confinement shaped every action, making small achievements a full breath, a quiet hour, a stolen scrap of comfort feel monumental. The prison's relentless structure tested not only the body, but also the mind, bending and shaping those within to its rhythms. Within these early hours, patterns of coping emerged. Some prisoners immersed themselves in routine folding cloth, arranging straw, or quietly observing the patterns of life around them. Others meditated silently, eyes closed, counting breaths or replaying distant memories. Small gestures of rebellion, adjusting one's clothing, marking a wall with a hidden symbol, whispering a prayer became acts of resistance. These were ways to assert individuality against the homogenizing force of the prison. Through routine observation and subtle resistance, prisoners navigated the oppressive environment, preserving the fragile sense of self that kept them tethered to reality. By mid-morning, the prisoners had settled into a rhythm that balanced survival and awareness. Each breath, movement, and glance was part of a calculated strategy designed to maintain life and, where possible, dignity. They learned to interpret every sound, anticipate every step of the warden, and negotiate every interaction with care. In these hours, the foundations of endurance were laid not in grand gestures, but in small, deliberate acts of observation, patience, and subtle assertion of control. Within the cold stone walls, the human spirit adapted, creating a microcosm of life that, though harsh and unforgiving, preserved resilience, cunning, and the faint glimmer of hope. As the first stretch of the day drew toward its next phase, meals, labor, and the relentless tests of both body and mind, prisoners braced themselves. They had survived the morning with its tentative motions, whispered observations, and small triumphs over discomfort. They had learned the rhythms of their captors, the limitations of their bodies, and the subtle dynamics of their fellow prisoners. In the confines of stone and iron, morning had passed, leaving in its wake the quiet assertion of human endurance. Though the challenges ahead were immense, these hours had demonstrated that even in the harshest of places, life found ways to persist, adapt, and endure. The midday light filtered through the narrow slits of the prison walls, falling in sharp, cold beams onto the damp stone floors. It barely illuminated the grim tableau within the courtyards and labor halls, but for prisoners, even a sliver of sunlight was a reminder that life continued outside the suffocating walls. Hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing at the stomachs and minds of those confined, shaping every movement and thought. The simplest acts, reaching for a scrap of bread, lifting a jug of water, were transformed into strategic decisions measured against the scarcity that defined each day. The morning's labor had left many prisoners exhausted, muscles stiff and aching joints protesting under the weight of forced exertion. Their hands bore cuts and blisters, yet they moved with mechanical precision toward the meager offerings of sustenance. The prison kitchen, if it could be called that, was little more than a stone hearth and a few iron pots blackened with decades of use. From these humble implements emerged the staple provisions, a thin, watery porridge, occasionally flavored with a few grains or foraged herbs, and hard, dry bread that cracked under the teeth. Water, often stagnant or mingled with silt, was rationed sparingly. The act of eating was laden with tension. Prisoners approached the scant rations cautiously aware that any sudden movements could attract the attention of a guard or a more desperate inmate. Each portion was weighed, measured, and consumed with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. In some cells, the sharing of bread or porridge formed unspoken alliances. In others, competition flared into whispered threats or open scuffles. Food was not merely nourishment, it was a currency, a tool of negotiation, and a weapon in itself. Disease stalked the prison as invisibly as hunger. Dampness clung to walls and floors, creating an environment rife with the potential for illness. Mold crept along corners, feeding on the constant presence of moisture, while vermin, rats, and mice moved stealthily through the shadows, scavenging crumbs and spreading contagion. Lice infested hair and clothing, gnawing at flesh and sanity alike. The unwashed, overcrowded cells became incubators for fevers, skin infections, and respiratory ailments. Inmates understood instinctively that proximity to sickness could be as dangerous as exposure to punishment. Despite these conditions, prisoners demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Some fashioned rudimentary spoons from wood or scraps of metal, using them to maximize intake of the thin porridge. Others soaked hard bread to soften it, preserving teeth from further wear. Certain prisoners learned to identify the slightly cleaner portions of water, the tiniest sign of freshness amidst the sludge. Knowledge was shared, quietly passed from one cell to another, through gestures, whispers, or scraps of parchment where allowed. These small acts of resourcefulness became lifelines, tools to stretch the scant provisions across hours, even days. The ritual of eating was not devoid of hierarchy. Guards often determined the distribution of rations, rewarding compliance or punishing defiance with more or less food. Some prisoners had learned to curry favor, subtly bowing at precise angles, muttering the expected words of respect, or performing minor tasks without request. Those who failed to anticipate or adhere to these invisible codes risked the indignity of receiving only the smallest scraps or none at all. The power embedded in food reinforced the structures of domination within the prison, demonstrating that survival required both physical and psychological acumen. Hunger, however, was not solely a matter of quantity. The monotonous sameness of the meals, the scarcity of flavor, and the absence of warmth weighed heavily on prisoners' spirits. Taste, once a source of comfort, became an acute reminder of deprivation. The mere act of chewing was a sensory negotiation, balancing necessity against disgust, sustenance against the memory of richer foods now inaccessible. Prisoners relied on imagination as much as appetite, recalling the texture of fresh bread, the sweetness of ripe fruit, or the savor of salted meat. These memories became mental sustenance, feeding the mind when the body could not be satisfied. Disease was as much a social phenomenon as it was physical. Close quarters ensured that ailments spread quickly, and fear dictated interactions. Prisoners instinctively avoided those with obvious signs of illness, yet care was sometimes unavoidable, sharing a container of water, assisting in labor, or responding to a neighbor's call for help. These moments of proximity were fraught with tension, the need for survival balanced against the risk of infection. In this precarious equilibrium, prisoners developed strategies of observation, noting coughs, rashes, or lethargy, and adjusting their behavior accordingly. Survival was as much about awareness and anticipation as it was about endurance. The morning's labor and the first distribution of food merged into a rhythm that dominated the prisoner's experience of time. Each bite, each gulp of water, each movement through the courtyard was measured, calculated, and observed. Prisoners learned to pace themselves, conserving energy, while maintaining the outward appearance of compliance. They practiced restraint, swallowing hunger with silent determination, and seeking comfort in the smallest victories, stretching the porridge, further securing an extra scrap of bread, or avoiding the notice of a particularly harsh guard. These small triumphs were magnified by necessity, each a step in the ongoing struggle to preserve life and dignity. Prisoners' physical condition was inseparable from mental endurance. Hunger gnawed not only at the body, but at resolve and morale. The weight of expectation, the constant vigilance, and the relentless scarcity pressed upon every thought. Some prisoners retreated inward, occupying their minds with memories of home, family, or past freedoms. Others sought to distract themselves through observation, tracking the guards' patterns, calculating the timing of meals, or silently analyzing the dynamics among fellow inmates. Survival demanded a mind attuned to its environment, capable of extracting advantage from even the smallest cues. The midday meal often concluded with a lingering, almost ritualized silence. Prisoners returned to their cells, the empty bowls clutched for possible reuse or hidden crumbs, each step measured to avoid attracting attention. The echoes of scraping metal and stone, the soft murmurs of other inmates, and the distant shuffle of guards created a soundscape that was at once oppressive and informative. Every footfall, every clink of utensils, every breath carried potential meaning, a signal of threat opportunity, or the faintest reassurance. In this environment, perception became as vital as physical endurance. As the day moved toward the next phase, further labor rest, or the unpredictable interventions of wardens, prisoners carried with them the memory of this first ration. Hunger, disease, and deprivation would persist relentless in their pressure. Yet even within these constraints, they had demonstrated resilience, extracting sustenance from meager provisions, sharing what was possible, and maintaining a fragile sense of dignity amidst the decay. Food had become more than nourishment. It was a measure of control, a signal of hierarchy, and a touchstone of human perseverance in the unforgiving landscape of medieval incarceration. Afternoon settled over the prison like a shroud, the muted sunlight struggling through narrow openings to illuminate the stone walls. The midday meal, meager as it was left, its lingering effects, a hollow fullness in some, a gnawing emptiness in others, and a persistent thirst for water that could not easily be sated. Hunger, an omnipresent specter, shaped the rhythm of life, dictating the prisoner's movements, strategies, and interactions. Every eye flicked toward the next distribution of sustenance with a mixture of hope, fear, and calculation. Within the confines of the cells, whispers of shared resources emerged. Prisoners negotiated quietly, offering tiny portions of bread or porridge in exchange for assistance, information, or protection. These exchanges created a fragile economy built on scarcity trust and the constant risk of betrayal. Each hand extended carried weight beyond mere food. It was a test of allegiance, a gamble of survival. In some instances, prisoners would conceal portions, tucking crumbs beneath straw, or within the folds of tattered clothing, a secret lifeline to be drawn upon in moments of greatest need. Disease continued to assert its quiet dominion. Fevers and chills swept through the prison in waves, leaving the weak and ill struggling for each breath. The stench of unwashed bodies mingled with the faintly sour smell of spoiled food and stagnant water permeated every space. Those who were infirm were often left to their own devices, confined to dark corners, or assigned to the most uncomfortable cells. Yet even in this harsh neglect, small acts of care persisted. A fellow prisoner offering a sip of water, covering another with a tattered blanket, or simply whispering words of encouragement. These gestures, though minor, carried the weight of shared humanity in a place designed to erode it. Guards moved through the corridors with methodical precision, observing the allocation of food and the condition of the prisoners. Their presence reinforced the power dynamics inherent in every meal. A sudden glance or sharp command could alter the course of a ration, redistributing portions according to perceived obedience or favor. Prisoners learned to read these subtle signals, calibrating their behavior to maintain a delicate balance between compliance and self-preservation. In this environment, food was more than sustenance. It was leverage, a means to enforce authority, and a test of the prisoner's capacity for adaptability. The physical toll of prolonged deprivation was evident in every gesture. Hands shook as they lifted bowls, backs hunched under the combined weight of fatigue and malnourishment, and faces displayed the pallor of chronic hunger. Teeth worn from biting hard bread carried the remnants of countless past meals, a testament to the enduring struggle for nourishment. Each bite was deliberate, a careful rationing of energy and strength. Prisoners calculated how to preserve the most nutrition for the longest possible duration, aware that the next meal might be delayed or insufficient. Hunger also shaped the mind. Prisoners' thoughts circled constantly around food, planning, remembering, and anticipating. Memories of family meals, village feasts, or market bread became mental sustenance comforting the mind while the body suffered. In some cases, these memories carried a painful duality, a reminder of what was lost, and a motivator to endure. The human capacity to imagine, to retain hope, and to strategize became critical tools of survival. Hunger, though debilitating, could not extinguish the prisoner's need to plan, to learn, and to adapt. Disease and malnutrition were intertwined, each exacerbating the effects of the other. The weakened bodies of the prisoners could not resist the infections that spread swiftly in overcrowded cells. Coughs, rashes, and open sores went untreated, creating networks of vulnerability. Inmates who fell ill often faced isolation, a double-edged sword protection from contagion, yet intensified exposure to neglect and despair. Those who remained relatively healthy walked a fine line, providing minimal aid to the sick while guarding their own limited strength. Survival required not only physical endurance, but an acute understanding of human behavior under stress. Despite these conditions, prisoners developed adaptive strategies. Some learned to barter skills or labor in exchange for slightly better portions, offering to scrub floors, organize straw bedding, or deliver messages. Others relied on observation, noting the habits of guards and timing their movements to access water or scraps unnoticed. Creativity became an essential survival skill. As the prisoners navigated a world designed to strip away autonomy, dignity, and sustenance. Even in the direst circumstances, the instinct to endure and the ingenuity to manipulate scarce resources flourished. The psychological impact of hunger was profound. Anxiety and irritability ran rampant, amplified by the confined environment. Disputes over food, however minor, could escalate into violence, and prisoners learned to negotiate peace where possible. Silence, concealment, and subtlety became weapons, and every interaction was weighed for risk and benefit. Hunger shaped morality, loyalty, and social dynamics within the prison walls, creating a microcosm of society, governed by scarcity rather than law. As the afternoon waned, the prisoners' energy ebbed further. Yet the next round of labor approached. Carrying heavy loads, scrubbing floors, and enduring punishments required a resilience fueled by imagination and small stores of energy carefully conserved. Each step was a negotiation with the body, push forward and risk collapse, or conserve strength and face reprimand or punishment. Hunger, intertwined with fatigue, created a relentless feedback loop, testing both physical endurance and mental fortitude. Even in the face of such deprivation, moments of small triumph arose. A prisoner who secured an extra piece of bread shared it quietly with a friend. Another found a cleaner stream of water for their cell. Yet another discovered a slightly more comfortable corner to rest. These minor victories were magnified in significance, offering temporary relief, hope, and a sense of agency. In a world designed to reduce them to objects of control, prisoners reclaimed fragments of humanity through resourcefulness and quiet cooperation. By evening, the courtyard and cells settled into an uneasy calm. Shadows stretched along the walls, muting the sounds of movement and conversation. Hunger remained gnawing at the edges of consciousness, yet a fragile sense of order emerged. Prisoners understood the rhythms of rationing, the timing of labor, and the patterns of disease and neglect. Survival depended on attentiveness, strategy, and endurance, an unending cycle of observation, calculation, and adaptation. Food hunger and disease had shaped the prisoner's day as surely as the walls themselves. They dictated movement alliances and conflicts, weaving a complex tapestry of human behavior under extreme pressure. The struggle for sustenance was inseparable from the struggle for life dignity and sanity. In the stark, cold environment of the medieval prison, every meal, every sip of water, every effort to avoid contagion became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As night approached, prisoners prepared for the next stage of the day labor punishment or the uncertain movements of the guards. The lessons of the midday meal lingered. Hunger could be managed, disease-anticipated alliances formed. Survival required vigilance, adaptability, and the continuous negotiation of scarcity. In this harsh microcosm, the interplay of food and illness revealed the fragile balance between endurance and collapse, shaping the prisoners' bodies, minds, and relationships in ways that would echo long after the day ended. The clang of iron tools striking stone echoed through the corridors as prisoners were summoned to the labor yards. Sunlight, thin and pale, fell unevenly across the uneven cobblestones, casting sharp shadows that mirrored the harsh contours of the prisoners' faces. Here, labor was not merely work. It was a relentless test of endurance, a measure of obedience, and a daily reminder that the body belonged to the prison, not to the individual. Prisoners lifted heavy stones, their hands blistered and raw, their backs hunched from the weight of repeated toil. Each block carried the cold imprint of past failures and the silent threat of punishment should the work lag. Some carried water in pails along treacherous pathways, the sloshing liquid threatening to spill and bring the wrath of the guards down upon them. Others swept the yard, scraping the remnants of mud and waste into pits that would never truly disappear. In these acts, the prisoners discovered both their limits and the quiet persistence of human labor under duress. The guards watched with keen eyes, measuring effort and patience with a gaze sharpened by years of authority. One misstep, a dropped stone, a faltering stride was enough to trigger immediate reprimand. Ropes, whips, and wooden batons were always within reach, instruments of correction and intimidation designed to maintain control. Punishment was administered swiftly, publicly, and without debate, a performance of power meant to discourage dissent and inspire fear. Prisoners learned to calibrate their movements to anticipate every expectation and to endure both the physical and psychological toll of their labor. Even as the work proceeded, the sun's heat pressed down on the laboring bodies, a slow and unyielding force. Sweat-streaked faces, soaked garments clung to skin, and the relentless exertion drained energy faster than any hunger could. The labor was never ending. The pile of stones never diminished, the tasks never concluded. Yet within this unrelenting routine, a rhythm emerged. Prisoners synchronized with one another, learning to move in unison, to whisper encouragement, and to anticipate the guards' movements. Coordination became survival, and solidarity, however fragile, offered small relief from the oppressive weight of authority. The physical consequences were immediate and severe. Blisters formed on hands, muscles ached with every lift and carry, and bones protested against the unnatural postures demanded by the work. Some prisoners stumbled only to be prodded back into action, their failure recorded in the silent ledger of the guards' observations. Fatigue was a constant companion, and yet there was little opportunity for rest. Even a brief pause could invite punishment, making endurance as much a mental challenge as a physical one. Punishment extended beyond the labor yard. Those deemed insufficiently obedient, sluggish, or insubordinate were subjected to additional measures designed to break both body and spirit. The whipping post stood in stark contrast to the work area, a place of immediate and public humiliation. The strokes fell with precision, leaving the skin raw, the muscles tensed, and the prisoner's dignity in tatters. In other cases, gongs, chains, and iron cuffs were employed to restrict movement, intensifying the suffering during labor, or while confined to a cell. The interplay between work and punishment created a continuum of control. The labor was both necessity and spectacle, endurance and intimidation intertwined. Within this brutal system, prisoners found subtle ways to resist or mitigate suffering. Some learned to shift weight strategically, using their bodies to absorb shocks and distribute strain. Others timed their breathing, counting steps and breaths to maintain rhythm and stave off panic. Small alliances formed in the labor yard, mutual support, shared knowledge of guard patterns, or an understanding of the precise timing of tasks. These tiny acts of coordination and strategy became essential, preserving not only life, but a shred of agency amid the overwhelming power of the institution. The noise of labor, harsh and repetitive, mingled with groans, curses, and the occasional cry of pain. The prison itself seemed to pulse with this cacophony walls, resonating with the collective exertion and suffering of those confined within. Even in this chaos, prisoners developed acute awareness, the angle of sunlight, the timing of guards' inspections, the subtle signals of fellow inmates. Survival demanded constant attention, a mental sharpness as critical as physical strength. Each movement, each decision, became a calculated measure to endure yet avoid further punishment. The psychological weight of labor and punishment compounded over hours, pressing relentlessly on mind and body. Prisoners experienced moments of despair, fleeting visions of freedom, and the creeping awareness that the next day would mirror the last. Yet even amid exhaustion and fear, the human spirit persisted. Strategies for endurance, however minute, balancing burdens, sharing secret encouragements, or marking progress, silently offered threads of hope. These small acts, invisible to the guards, sustained morale and preserved a measure of identity in an environment intent on erasing individuality. Interactions during labor were careful, measured, and fraught with risk. A misplaced word or glance could draw scrutiny, yet shared effort fostered quiet bonds. Prisoners developed an intricate understanding of social dynamics, who to watch, who to avoid, and who might offer assistance in a moment of weakness. These micro-networks became essential, providing support in the face of extreme adversity. Solidarity, forged under pressure, became a silent form of resistance, a reminder that even in confinement, human connection could endure. The labor yard was not merely a place of work. It was a theater of control, endurance, and adaptation. Every stone lifted, every sweep of the broom, every movement under the sun or within shadow carried weight beyond the immediate task. Labor was punishment, but it was also the crucible through which prisoners honed resilience, resourcefulness, and a keen understanding of authority. The rhythm of toil, interspersed with pain and vigilance, created a landscape where survival depended on precision timing and the ability to endure both visible and invisible pressures. As the afternoon wore on, the intensity of labor did not diminish. Sweat and fatigue accumulated, and yet prisoners continued, driven by necessity, fear, and the faint glimmers of solidarity. Each task completed offered a temporary reprieve, however fleeting, before the next wave of work arrived. The interplay between endurance and punishment underscored the precariousness of their existence. Life was contingent, fragile, and constantly under scrutiny. By the time the guard's watch shifted and evening approached, prisoners were spent, bodies heavy with exertion, muscles trembling, and minds strained by constant vigilance. The labor had taken its toll, yet it was only one phase of the day's cycle. Punishment and supervision extended into every corner, shaping behavior, enforcing rules, and defining the contours of daily existence. In the medieval prison labor, was survival endurance and subjugation, intertwined a crucible in which prisoners were tested at every moment. Even in these harsh conditions, subtle victories persisted. A task completed without reprimand, a momentary ease of movement, a whispered word of support from a neighbor. These ephemeral successes were critical, sustaining the will to continue to endure and to prepare for the inevitable continuation of labor and oversight. In the endless interplay of exertion and authority, prisoners learned the value of precision, patience, and perseverance, qualities that would serve them in the days yet to come. As the afternoon deepened, the labor yard's atmosphere thickened with fatigue dust and the sharp tang of sweat. Shadows lengthened across cobblestones slick with grime, yet the work never slowed. The prisoners' movements had become almost automatic, a mechanical rhythm born of relentless repetition. Each lifted stone, each sweep of a broom, was executed with careful attention, not for pride, but to survive the ever-present scrutiny of the guards. In this crucible, even the smallest lapse could provoke punishment swift and unrelenting. The guards moved among them, eyes keen and unyielding, inspecting every action. One faltered step. One stone dropped too heavily, and a shout rang out, followed by the crack of a whip. The sound struck like lightning, reverberating across the yard, and the prisoner at fault shrank under its echo. Pain, both immediate and lingering, spread across taut muscles and blistered hands. The act was not only corrective, but performative, a demonstration of authority meant to remind all that every moment of labor was a test, every misstep a possible prelude to suffering. Punishments were precise, almost ritualistic in their execution. A wooden rod, worn smooth by decades of use, struck with measured force, leaving welts that burned long after the initial sting. Iron cuffs clamped with an unyielding grip, restricting movement and intensifying the strain of labor. Those unlucky enough to be subjected to standing posts or forced squats felt every joint protest, their bodies bending toward exhaustion under the gaze of the overseers. The prison was both arena and stage, where endurance, fear, and discipline intersected in brutal harmony. Despite the severity, prisoners adapted. Subtle shifts in posture reduced strain. Breaths were counted and synchronized with movement to conserve energy. Hands developed calluses that tempered the sting of repetitive work. Even in the face of oppression, small victories were claimed quietly. A stone perfectly positioned, a task completed with minimal error, a guard momentarily distracted. These fleeting triumphs were threads of control, reminders that the body, though constrained, could still exercise agency. Social dynamics within the labor yard were equally critical. Prisoners observed one another with keen awareness, noting weaknesses, strengths, and tendencies. Alliances, fragile and often temporary, formed in whispers and subtle gestures. A glance could communicate timing. A shared nod could coordinate lifting or carrying burdens. These connections, delicate yet vital, offered moments of relief amid the relentless rhythm of toil. Cooperation became survival. Trust, however tentative, became a rare and precious commodity. As the sun dipped lower, the intensity of labor shifted, but did not diminish. Evening tasks arrived, cleaning, transporting water, tending to areas that had been neglected during the heat of the day. Fatigue deepened, yet prisoners pressed on, driven by a combination of necessity, fear, and a stubborn desire to endure. Each task demanded precision, not only to avoid punishment, but also to conserve energy and maintain the fragile balance between survival and collapse. The psychological weight was as heavy as the physical. Prisoners internalized every expectation, every glance of the guards, every whispered instruction. Anxiety threaded through each movement, a constant companion that magnified exhaustion. Sleep-deprived minds were tested as much as bodies with focus and vigilance critical to avoiding missteps. The labor yard was a theater of endurance, but it was also a crucible of mental fortitude, shaping those who survived in ways that extended far beyond the physical realm. Punishment extended seamlessly from work to intimidation. A prisoner who lagged slightly might be singled out for public chastisement, bent over a stone, hands pressed to the rough surface as the guard administered precise blows to hands, back, or shoulders. Pain became a teacher, instilling discipline and reinforcing the invisible rules of conduct. Whispers of warning passed among inmates, cautionary tales of those who faltered, serving as both instruction and deterrent. The hierarchy of authority within the yard was unambiguous. Obedience was not optional, and endurance was mandatory. Yet even amidst suffering, subtle forms of resistance persisted. Prisoners learned to manage their pace, to conserve energy where possible, and to find small moments of relief within the rigors of labor. The act of enduring itself became a quiet defiance, a claim to dignity in a place designed to erase it. Observing and assisting one another in subtle ways, sharing a glance of reassurance, timing movements together, became acts of solidarity that preserved a measure of humanity within a system intent on eroding it. The interplay between labor and punishment created a relentless cycle. Exertion was always measured against the looming possibility of discipline. Stone after stone, sweep after sweep, prisoners existed in a space defined by authority, endurance, and anticipation. Even minor achievements, positioning a stone, correctly completing a task, without reprimand, offered brief relief, but never absolution. Every act of labor was both necessity and instrument, a performance under observation, a contest of will against both environment and oppressors. As twilight approached, the labor yard began to empty slowly. Prisoners exhausted returned to cells with aching muscles, bruised skin, and minds sharpened by the day's pressures. Yet the cycle was far from over. Punishment, vigilance, and preparation for the next day's labor continued to weigh on every thought. Rest offered only temporary respite. The demands of survival, both immediate and perpetual, awaited with the coming dawn. Even in these closing hours, the yard bore witness to the extremes of human endurance. A fallen prisoner might receive assistance from a neighbor. A brief exchange of whispered instruction might prevent future mistakes, and strategies, refined over countless days, ensured that the fragile balance between survival and subjugation persisted. These moments of subtle ingenuity were vital. Without them, exhaustion would quickly give way to despair. The final rays of light highlighted the harsh contours of the prison, emphasizing both the majesty and cruelty of the stone walls. Within their shadows, prisoners' bodies bore the marks of labor, endurance, and punishment. The yard emptied, yet still resonant, with the echoes of toil symbolized the unyielding cycle of life inside the prison, a constant negotiation between survival and subjugation, exertion and reprieve, obedience, and the faint glimmers of resistance. By nightfall, prisoners were returned to their cells, their muscles screaming, their spirits strained yet still capable of reflection and fleeting hope. The labor had tested limits, exposed vulnerabilities, and reinforced the omnipresent power of the guards. It had also revealed the prisoners' resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet, often invisible forms of solidarity that persisted despite every attempt to suppress them. In the medieval prison, labor and punishment were inseparable, shaping the very essence of daily existence and leaving indelible marks upon both body and mind. The stone corridors of the prison echoed with the faintest of sounds, a scuff of feet, the whisper of fabric against rough stone, the subtle shift of someone settling onto the cold floor. Here in the waning light of day, the atmosphere changed. The labor yard, with its relentless exertion and ever-watchful guards, faded into memory. Within the confines of the cells, the prisoners' attention shifted inward and toward each other, seeking connections, information, and fleeting moments of human contact. In these narrow, shadowed spaces, whispers carried weight far greater than the clamor of the yard. Among the prisoners, a delicate web of communication had formed over weeks, months, and sometimes years. Each whisper, each subtle gesture held layers of meaning. A glance exchanged across the corridor might convey a warning about a particularly cruel guard or the timing of a routine inspection. A soft cough could signal readiness or danger. Every action was deliberate, each movement carefully measured to avoid the notice of guards while preserving the fragile bonds of trust. In these exchanges, knowledge and survival intertwined. The sharing of information was not merely practical. It was a form of solace. Stories of the outside world, once lived and now only remembered, were recounted quietly. A village fair, the seasonal patterns of harvest, or a festival long past. These tales offered brief escapes from the oppressive present moments in which prisoners could imagine lives beyond the prison walls. Listening to became a skill. Discerning truth from exaggeration or rumor required attentiveness, a keen mind, and an understanding of the storyteller's motivations. In a place where misinformation could be dangerous, wisdom was essential. Some whispered of plans fragile and often fantastical for escape. Routes were discussed in hushed tones, noting structural weaknesses, timing of guard patrols, and the behaviors of those who controlled the prison. Maps of the prison existed only in memory, traced in the air with fingers or drawn crudely in dust or straw. Each plan was tentative, requiring consensus, and trust for betrayal could be fatal. Even the act of discussing escape became an assertion of autonomy, a way for prisoners to assert mental control in a place designed to strip them of agency. These exchanges were not without risk. Guards sometimes lingered their steps, silent, but deliberate eyes sharp for any sign of conspiracy. The prisoners learned to speak in riddles, to mask intentions behind seemingly innocuous conversation, to listen without appearing attentive. The art of subtlety became as vital as strength or endurance. Every whispered word was a calculated risk, a delicate balance between necessity and exposure. Mistakes could result in punishment, sometimes public, and humiliating, reminding all that freedom of speech was a luxury denied within these walls. Bonds of solidarity grew, in these moments fragile yet essential. Prisoners offered advice on avoiding punishment, shared tips for easing labor, or exchanged small comforts such as a piece of bread or a portion of water. Even the simplest gestures carried profound significance, reinforcing communal survival. Trust became a form of currency, and the careful allocation of it could determine not only one's comfort, but also one's life. Alliances, whether temporary or long-term, were forged with careful calculation, each participant aware that betrayal could arrive from within as easily as from without. Stories of former lives were retold in painstaking detail. A farmer recalling the rhythm of planting and harvest. A merchant describing the bustle of the market. A scholar remembering the quiet refuge of a library or scriptorium. These narratives were more than nostalgia. They were instruments of resilience, ways to maintain identity when all external markers had been stripped away. In recounting such tales, prisoners reminded themselves and each other that they were more than mere captives. They were still human beings, each with history, knowledge, and memory. Among these whispered exchanges, hierarchies subtly emerged. Prisoners of experience, those who had endured years within the stone walls, became informal leaders. Their knowledge of guard routines, hidden weaknesses in infrastructure, or strategies to endure punishment was invaluable. Younger or newer prisoners deferred to their counsel, absorbing the unspoken rules of survival. Respect was earned through demonstration of competence, courage, and discretion, rather than coercion. In this shadow society, authority was negotiated through reputation and shared understanding rather than force alone. Even humor found its place in these whispered interactions. Softly shared jokes, ironic observations about the harshness of life behind stone walls, and clever plays on words provided relief from the ever-present tension. Laughter, though quiet and fleeting, acted as a balm, a subtle assertion that even in confinement, prisoners retained the capacity for levity. These moments of shared amusement strengthened bonds, creating cohesion among those who might otherwise remain isolated within their cells. Prisoners also engaged in a subtle economy of information. Knowledge of outside events, news from town's market conditions, or political shifts could be as valuable as food or tools. Smuggled notes, overheard conversations, or rumors passed by our guards became currency, exchanged discreetly for favors, protection, or even minor privileges. The careful acquisition and dissemination of information required vigilance and prudence. Mismanagement of such knowledge could lead to punishment, or in extreme cases, death. The rhythm of whispers was punctuated by silence moments when even breath seemed dangerous. The awareness of constant surveillance, both overt and unseen, shaped every interaction. Prisoners developed instincts, senses honed by months of experience, detecting the subtle shift of a guard's attention, hearing the faintest footstep, signaling approach, or reading the unspoken cues of fellow inmates. In these tense intervals, the unspoken language of survival spoke volumes, conveying urgency, reassurance, or warning without a single audible word. Yet for all the fear and caution, there was resilience. Whispers were acts of defiance, asserting the continuity of thought, memory, and agency against a system designed to suppress them. The very act of sharing, of connecting, of maintaining relationships in such an environment became a testament to human endurance. Prisoners understood that their physical confinement did not necessarily dictate their mental or emotional boundaries. Even within stone walls, the mind could remain free. As the daylight faded and shadows deepened, the prison shifted subtly. The labor had ended, the day's punishment subsided, and the cells became arenas of quiet strategy. Plans, whispered stories, recounted advice, given and received, all reinforced the web of survival. Bonds, alliances, and knowledge intertwined, preparing the prisoners for the night ahead when fatigue, fear, and reflection would dominate the hours. In these interactions, prisoners exercised a form of sovereignty within confinement, wielding the power of communication as both shield and sword. In the heart of the prison, the chorus of whispers created a living tapestry. Each voice, soft and deliberate, contributed to a network of understanding and survival. Some whispers conveyed hope, some caution, others frustration, yet all were essential. The collective murmur became a lifeline, a signal that though the stone walls were unyielding, human connection could persist. The prisoners' resilience, ingenuity, and capacity for subtle defiance revealed that even in the harshest conditions, the spirit could endure. The day's labor had tested body and mind, but the whispers behind bars tested the prisoner's wit, judgment, and emotional intelligence. Listening, discerning, and speaking with care became acts of strategy as vital as any physical exertion. In the shadows of the medieval prison, these whispered interactions shaped alliances, preserved morale, and cultivated hope, often the most critical resource of all. As night approached, the whispers would continue, even as fatigue settled upon bodies and the cold stone seeped into bones. The prisoners, though confined, were not silent. Each whispered exchange was a thread of resilience weaving together the human elements that the prison sought to suppress. Through this delicate, invisible communication, they remained in some small measure masters of their own destinies. The dim glow of torchlight barely reached the corners of the stone cells, yet it was enough for the prisoners to navigate the intricate network of whispers with precision. In this half-light, the spoken word became currency and silence a shield. Knowledge of guard patterns, hidden corners, and even the moods of those in authority circulated cautiously, passed from one trusted hand to another. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the tension of unspoken threats, delicate hopes, and the fragile trust that bound these unwilling companions together. A young scribe, barely more than a boy, huddled against the cold stone wall. He listened intently as an older prisoner, a man who had spent a decade within these walls, described the subtle cracks in the mortar, the sections of corridor where the torchlight never quite reached, and the timing of guard rotations. Every detail was precious. In this place, even the faintest advantage could mean the difference between survival and punishment. The scribe committed each piece of advice to memory, understanding that discretion was paramount. Within these whispered networks, alliances formed across cell blocks. Prisoners learned to read each other with meticulous care, discerning who could be trusted, who might exploit a slip, and who had nothing to lose. The exchange of information was often layered, containing half-truths designed to gauge loyalty or mislead potential eavesdroppers. In a prison where every secret could be deadly, deception and strategy were as essential as physical strength or endurance. Even the simplest story of life outside the walls could be a test, a subtle probe of character and intent. Amid the practical advice and survival strategies, stories of past glories and regrets surfaced. A knight once noble and respected spoke of battles fought, loyalties betrayed, and lands lost. A merchant recalled caravans disrupted by bandits and armies alike, illustrating the precarity of life even beyond the prison gates. These narratives served not only as distraction, but as lessons. In their shared suffering, prisoners found perspective. Life was fleeting, and the wisdom of experience could offer both comfort and guidance. Some whispers were meant to preserve memory, to keep alive traditions and customs that the oppressive environment sought to erase. Songs hummed softly, altered to fit the prison's constraints. Prayers were murmured in fragments. Tales of festivals, markets, and the rhythms of village life were recounted in quiet reverence. These cultural threads provided a lifeline, a reminder that the world outside persisted, that beauty and community could survive even in confinement. Through these whispered rituals, prisoners maintained a sense of identity and continuity. Among the prisoners, an informal hierarchy became evident. Those who had mastered the art of communication, who could discern intention, craft plausible stories, or strategically conceal knowledge, held sway. Younger or less experienced inmates deferred to them, seeking counsel on avoiding punishment, securing extra rations, or navigating disputes. Leadership here was not enforced through violence alone. It relied on competence, discretion, and the ability to foster trust. Those who failed in this subtle diplomacy often found themselves isolated, vulnerable, and increasingly desperate. The sharing of rumors was an art form. News from the outside world, traders' gossip messages smuggled by visiting families, or hints overheard from the guards, was dissected and interpreted carefully. Truth and fiction intertwined, creating a tapestry that informed choices and shaped perceptions. Some prisoners hoarded information, using it as leverage. Others risked sharing it, strengthening alliances and reinforcing social bonds. In this delicate ecosystem, the strategic management of knowledge could provide protection, bargaining power, and hope. In quieter moments, prisoners explored the limits of their imagination. They whispered strategies for escapes that, while ambitious, were grounded in observation and careful planning. Each map traced in dust. Each observation about guard routines, each suggested hiding place or overlooked passage represented the cumulative effort of minds sharpened by confinement. These imagined escapes offered a psychological reprieve, a sense of agency in a place designed to erase it. Even the most improbable plan allowed prisoners to assert mental autonomy over their bodies. The bonds formed in these whispers were not solely strategic. They offered comfort, companionship, and emotional resilience. Sharing fears, small victories, or even jokes in hushed tones provided a measure of humanity in an otherwise dehumanizing environment. The mere act of being heard, of participating in a collective awareness, alleviated the crushing weight of isolation. Prisoners learned to rely on these interactions to gauge moods and to anticipate reactions, creating a microcosm of society within the confines of stone and iron. As the night deepened, the whispers evolved into a more intimate rhythm. Prisoners shared personal memories. Childhoods, lost family members, waiting loved ones, forgotten or betrayed. These exchanges reinforced empathy, solidarity, and a sense of shared destiny. Even the most hardened criminals found themselves influenced by stories of resilience, heartbreak, and survival. The whispered world became a realm of shared humanity, a sanctuary within the cold, unyielding prison walls. Even in the presence of fear and the constant threat of discovery, prisoners found ways to assert control over their environment through these subtle networks. Whispers carried warnings of potential danger, instructions on avoiding punishment, and strategies for maintaining dignity. They preserved the continuity of culture, identity, and memory. They provided the mental scaffolding upon which prisoners could support themselves and each other. In essence, whispers became lifelines, fragile, fleeting, yet indispensable. By the late hours, the prison seemed to hold its breath. Every sound was amplified: the creak of a hinge, the distant footfall of a guard, the murmur of conversations from another cell. Prisoners became attuned to the subtleties of their environment, able to interpret meaning in silence and partial words. Even the act of breathing was measured, calculated, and deliberate. In this shadowed, oppressive space, the whispers behind bars carried the weight of survival, resilience, and hope. And yet, despite the vigilance, fatigue, and fear, there remained a persistent undercurrent of rebellion, quiet, nonviolent, and deeply human. Through whispers, prisoners asserted that they were not entirely subdued, that their minds, emotions, and shared experiences remained beyond the reach of walls and chains. Every conversation, every secret shared, every story recounted was a small act of defiance, a declaration of existence and autonomy in a place that sought to diminish both. Trust, strategy, empathy, humor, and memory interwove to create a fragile, dynamic society. In the shadow of stone walls and under the ever-watchful eyes of guards, prisoners crafted a world of subtle connections, safeguarding not only survival, but also the essence of what it meant to remain human. The corridor leading to the interrogation chamber was narrow, lined with cold, unyielding stone that seemed to absorb the muffled echoes of every step. The prisoners were escorted in pairs, shackled by iron. Their movements restricted, their heads bowed. The air was thick with the mingled scents of damp stone sweat and the faint trace of fear that clung to each individual. Even before reaching the door, the oppressive weight of the room beyond seemed to press against their very bones, a silent herald of the ordeal awaiting them. Guards moved with deliberate, measured steps, their boots clanging against the flagstone floor. They exchanged no words, only glances that conveyed authority and a reminder that resistance was futile. The prisoners, stripped of autonomy, relied solely on their wits and the fleeting hope that discretion, compliance, or perhaps a clever answer might spare them from harsher scrutiny. Each carried the burden of uncertainty, a question that had no answer, yet demanded obedience. What would the interrogators demand, and what would they accept? The room itself was deceptively simple. A heavy wooden table dominated the center, scarred from years of repeated use. Iron rings affixed to the walls hinted at the measures once taken to restrain the unwilling. A single torch flickered, casting long shadows that danced and stretched, giving life to the otherwise inanimate stone. The atmosphere was tense, as though the very walls conspired to amplify every heartbeat, every intake of breath. The prisoners could almost hear their own fears reflected back at them from the cold surfaces surrounding them. Interrogation in this medieval prison was as much about psychological dominion as it was about extracting truth, or at least the confession deemed necessary by those in power. Words, gestures, and silence were wielded like instruments of authority. The interrogator's presence was a quiet menace, a calm exterior concealing the threat of sudden violence, the subtle manipulation of fear, and the weight of expectation. The room itself was a stage where the theater of power was performed daily, each participant acutely aware of their role and the stakes involved. As each prisoner was brought forward, the interrogators employed a precise rhythm, a cadence designed to unbalance, confuse, and exhaust. Questions were framed to entangle the mind, small contradictions, insinuations, and repeated inquiries that forced the subject to question memory, intention, and loyalty. In this environment, hesitation could be interpreted as guilt, silence as defiance, and nervousness as confirmation of wrongdoing. Every expression, every nuance, the language, was scrutinized with meticulous care. The prisoner's preparation was minimal. Some relied on instinct and past experience, others on mental fortitude, cultivated during months or years within the prison's walls. Strategies were improvised, a deliberate confusion, a measured delay, or the careful omission of information. Knowledge gained through whispered networks often proved invaluable here, as tips about the temperament of interrogators, favored phrases, or the timing of questioning could tilt the balance, if only slightly, in favor of the prisoner. There was an unspoken hierarchy even within the interrogators' ranks. Senior officers well versed in the art of elicitation guided younger acolytes through the subtleties of intimidation, observation, and manipulation. They moved with precision, conserving energy and authority, knowing that the psychological burden of the room was as effective a weapon as iron or fire. Their combined experience created a silent rhythm, a choreography of power designed to maintain control and extract desired outcomes without unnecessary exposure to physical risk. Prisoners, by contrast, were thrust into this environment with limited control and immense pressure. Many approached the room with a facade of calm, knowing that any visible fear could be exploited. Others were already frayed by months of confinement hunger and isolation, making every word, gesture, and thought a precarious exercise in survival. Within these confines, intelligence observation and emotional resilience became lifelines as critical as any physical skill honed elsewhere in the prison. The interrogators often employed subtle cues to unsettle. A raised eyebrow, a shift in seating, the deliberate silence following a response, each was designed to provoke reflection, anxiety, or involuntary revelation. The room itself contributed to this psychological warfare. Shadows lengthened and shortened unpredictably. With the flickering torch, the uneven stone floor echoed with every movement, and the high vaulted ceiling seemed to amplify isolation. In this carefully constructed environment, the prisoners' minds became the primary battlefield. Despite the intensity, some prisoners found methods to reclaim a fraction of agency. Small acts of resistance, a carefully measured reply, a misleading story, or even a strategic question served as reminders that they retained a measure of self-determination. Even within the walls of the interrogation room, where power dynamics were rigid and unyielding, ingenuity and mental acuity could carve narrow pathways to safety, or at least delay the inevitable. Each subtle maneuver was a statement. Though the walls enclosed them, the human spirit persisted. Outside the room, echoes of the questioning drifted down the corridor. Other prisoners waiting their turn, or listening from the shadows, absorbed every sound and word, mentally cataloging patterns and preparing for their own experience. Interrogation was both a personal trial and a communal lesson. Those who had endured emerged with knowledge and stories that circulated, informing, cautioning, and sometimes inspiring those who had yet to face the room's formidable presence. As the first part of the session drew to a close, the weight of the experience settled like a dense fog. The prisoners returned to their cells physically unharmed, but mentally burdened, carrying the memory of subtle threats, calculated silences, and the unrelenting pressure of scrutiny. The chamber remained behind them, silent yet alive, a reminder of the pervasive reach of authority and the intricate power dynamics that defined life within the medieval prison. And so, the interrogation room functioned not merely as a site of questioning, but as a crucible of control, shaping behavior, enforcing hierarchy, and testing resilience. It was a space where the mind, rather than the body alone, bore the greatest strain, where survival depended as much on cleverness and psychological endurance as it did on obedience or physical strength. Within its cold stone walls, every whispered rumor, every cautious observation, and every shadowed glance carried profound significance, influencing the lives and strategies of prisoners far beyond the room's threshold. The second part of the day in the interrogation room unfolded with an almost ritualistic precision. Prisoners returned in small groups, their footsteps heavy with the weariness of confinement, their minds already bracing for the unknown. Each individual carried a story, some true, some embellished, and some carefully concealed. The interrogators had long learned that patience often yielded more than force, that the subtle shift of a question or a momentary pause could extract confessions more effectively than chains or whips ever could. Within the chamber, the air seemed denser than before, saturated with tension and the unspoken understanding that every sound, no matter how small, could be scrutinized. The torches flickered shadows, stretching and twisting like living entities along the stone walls. It was in this interplay of light and darkness that the interrogators found their advantage. A gesture barely noticed in ordinary circumstances could suddenly become a sign of guilt. A tremor in a voice, a confession waiting to be claimed. Prisoners were seated on rough-hewn benches, or sometimes on the cold floor, their hands still shackled. The interrogators began a measured sequence of questions, each designed to elicit fragments of information that could later be pieced together. They listened intently to not only the words spoken, but also the pauses, the hesitations, and the inflections of tone. In this quiet observation, the prisoners' own minds often became their adversary, turning over every sentence, replaying every gesture, as they calculated the safest path forward. Some prisoners, attempted distraction, small acts to shift attention or divert scrutiny. A cough, a subtle change in posture, a deliberate glance elsewhere. These gestures, seemingly inconsequential, could subtly disrupt the rhythm the interrogators relied upon. Yet the experienced officers were attuned to such maneuvers. Any hint of evasion was met with a patient stare, an unblinking silence, or a gentle probing repetition of the same question. It was a psychological tug-of-war where mental stamina was as crucial as any physical endurance. Outside, the faint sounds of footsteps and distant murmurs reminded prisoners that their ordeal was part of a larger cycle within the prison. Each interrogation fed into the complex web of fear and control, reinforcing the power structure that governed the stone walls. Whispers passed through the corridors, stories of successful deflections, of clever words that spared a few, from harsher measures circulating like fragile threads of hope. Knowledge of these tales offered both guidance and pressure, every prisoner keenly aware of the potential for both triumph and failure. The interrogators frequently employed what seemed to be minor inconsistencies in a prisoner's account, using them to sow doubt, confusion, or anxiety. The mind stretched thin by confinement and uncertainty could betray itself, revealing more than intended. In this subtle warfare, a fleeting expression, a hesitation, or a poorly chosen word could open a chink in the prisoner's defenses. The room itself, cold and unyielding, amplified these vulnerabilities, turning the mental and emotional pressures of the interrogation into a tangible, almost suffocating presence. Some prisoners resorted to quiet resilience, adopting an air of calm defiance or silent compliance. They focused inward, repeating mental mantras, recalling distant memories, or drawing on past lessons learned within the prison walls. For these individuals, the room became a stage on which to perform controlled neutrality, a careful balancing act between appearing cooperative and preserving their integrity. Even here, within the rigid confines of authority, human ingenuity and willpower manifested in subtle but profound ways. Occasionally, interrogators would bring in objects or documents to influence the conversation, each item chosen to remind the prisoner of the wider power at play. A ledger showing debts, a piece of confiscated property, or simply the layout of the room itself served as constant silent reminders of the consequences of honesty, deception, or omission. The environment was meticulously curated, every detail of the chamber. The flickering torchlight, the echoing stone, the positioning of furniture reinforced the authority of those in power and magnified the psychological weight borne by the prisoners. By mid-session, fatigue set in. Prisoners' bodies remained physically intact, yet their minds were taxed to the point of near collapse. Long stretches of silence, punctuated by probing questions, created a rhythm that could exhaust even the most resilient. Here, endurance was paramount, a carefully measured answer. A calm demeanor, or a clever obfuscation, could be the difference between relative safety and the harsher measures awaiting those who faltered. The room exacted payment in the currency of attention, patience, and mental resilience, each prisoner negotiating with the limits of their own fortitude. Despite the intensity, moments of quiet revelation emerged. Prisoners sometimes shared inadvertent truths, small admissions, or carefully calculated statements that revealed patterns rather than specifics. Interrogators noted these details with precision, understanding that even the tiniest fragment of information could be compounded with others to build a larger picture. The process was as much about observation and deduction as it was about direct questioning. The room functioned as both crucible and canvas, where the human mind, under pressure, produced outcomes that were meticulously recorded, interpreted, and acted upon. As the final groups were dismissed, the chamber seemed to exhale, returning momentarily to stillness. The prisoners left the room, their minds heavy with the weight of scrutiny, the memory of unrelenting observation, and the subtle manipulations endured. Some emerged more resolved, armed with insights gained from surviving the ordeal, while others staggered under the psychological toll, their spirits fractured by the unyielding pressure. Outside, the corridors echoed with their footsteps, the silence following the interrogations almost deafening, in contrast to the intense mental exertion just completed. The interrogators remained reviewing their notes, recalibrating for the next session, and maintaining the aura of omnipotence. Within the walls of the chamber, authority had been exercised not through visible violence, but through control attention and the intricate dance of observation and response. The room itself stood as a testament to the power of psychological endurance, a place where intellect, willpower, and courage were tested against the meticulous authority of those who governed the prison. By the time the evening drew near, the interrogation chamber had fulfilled its role for the day. It was a site of subtle mastery, a room that demanded nothing less than complete presence of mind from all who entered. Though silent in its aftermath, it left behind ripples of fierce strategy and reflection that extended throughout the prison, shaping the behaviors, alliances, and strategies of those who would eventually face it themselves. Within its cold stone walls, the battle between authority and resilience had played out, leaving no participant unchanged. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, the prison transformed. Light faded and shadows lengthened, folding into the rough-hewn corners of the stone structure. The once familiar corridors, the echoing clatter of chains, and the measured footsteps of guards became something altogether different in the twilight. Darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was a living presence creeping over walls, settling in the cells, and seeping into the minds of those confined within. Prisoners who had endured the day's labors now faced the most insidious trial, the oppressive, unrelenting quiet of night. From the high windows near the ceilings, thin slivers of twilight cut across the stone floors, illuminating motes of dust dancing like tiny phantoms in the still air. Every creak of a hinge, every distant clatter, sounded amplified, reverberating through the narrow halls and into the cells. For those shackled or confined to damp corners, the ordinary noises of the prison transformed into portents, harbingers of unseen threats, or reminders of isolation. The night became a stage upon which the imagination could wander, unchecked, conjuring shadows that seemed to pulse with intent, whispering fears the daylight had suppressed. Prisoners huddled on rough straw or cold stone, seeking comfort where there was little. Some drew their knees to their chests, arms wrapped tightly around themselves, trying to reclaim a sense of security in a place that offered none. Others lay flat, staring into the darkness, willing their thoughts to remain disciplined, aware that even a stray memory could bloom into terror in the half-light. Sleep was a fragile gift, often broken by distant moans, the scratching of rats in walls, or the sudden echo of footsteps on stone stairs. In these moments, the mind became both companion and adversary, recalling regrets, lost lives, and fleeting glimpses of freedom once taken for granted. Small alliances formed, though rarely spoken aloud. Prisoners whispered cautiously to one another, sharing scraps of news or fragments of conversation overheard earlier in the day. The risk of betrayal was constant. Information could travel back to guards or rival inmates, but in the half-light of night, human connection offered the smallest glimmer of warmth, however fleeting. Stories of the outside world, families and villages, were retold, softened, and sometimes exaggerated, as if the telling itself could stave off despair. Even within these walls, the resilience of spirit flickered like the dim torchlight, fragile but persistent. Some prisoners employed ritualized motions to maintain sanity, tracing patterns on the floor, tapping rhythms with fingers on wooden beams, or repeating silent prayers learned long before imprisonment. Others murmured to themselves, rehearsing tales or reciting fragments of scripture, grounding themselves in memory and routine. These acts of self-soothing were more than habits. They were strategies of survival techniques honed through both desperation and ingenuity. In the absence of external control over their own bodies and time, the mind became the last domain where prisoners could exercise authority over their existence. Outside the cells, the guards' presence remained constant, but largely invisible. The rhythmic steps of the night watch patrolling corridors served both as reassurance and menace. For some prisoners, the sound meant security protection from internal threats. For others, it signaled the ever-present power of the wardens, the same authority that dictated labor punishment and interrogation. The delicate balance of fear and observation defined every moment of the night, each sound and shadow interpreted for possible meaning. Even the silence of the guards, when long and deliberate, became a weight pressing on the psyche, a reminder that the prisoners were never truly alone. In the shadows, rats scuttled across the floors and walls, their tiny claws scraping stone and straw. Their presence was at once mundane and terrifying, a reminder of the filth and neglect endemic to medieval prisons. The prisoners shared their space with these creatures, negotiating territory with wary caution. Some tried to ignore them. Others whispered to one another, crafting crude games or rituals to mark their presence. Even these small interactions carried significance, a reminder of life persisting amidst decay, of adaptability in the smallest and most unlikely forms. Nightfall amplified every sound. A distant drop of water echoed like a hammer strike. The chains rattling from a cell in the next corridor sounded like the clattering of heavy tools. Every cough, every suppressed groan drew attention and heightened tension. Eyes adjusted to dim light, searching for movement, for patterns in the shadows that might signal danger. The mind, deprived of distraction, magnified every sensory input. Fear became a constant companion, subtle yet pervasive, shaping each thought, each breath, and each shiver that ran down the spine. Prisoners also grappled with bodily discomfort, the itch of lice, the ache of cramped muscles, the persistent damp chill that clung to bones through stone walls. Hunger, though, sated partially by the meager rations of the day, lingered as a gnawing presence, intensifying fatigue and irritability. In the convergence of physical suffering and mental strain, the night exacted its toll with methodical precision. It revealed the human condition in its starkest form, the intersection of vulnerability, resilience, and the relentless passage of time. Some prisoners tried to occupy themselves through memory or imagination, recalling forests, rivers, and fields far beyond the prison walls. They traced imaginary paths, recounted the rhythm of daily work, or revisited conversations from past lives. Others devised minute tasks, sorting straw, shifting stones, or cleaning corners of their small cells. These acts, seemingly trivial, offered a fragile illusion of control. In a world dictated by iron stone and authority, the power of the mind to create order, however fleeting, became essential to survival. As darkness deepened, the prison itself seemed to pulse with life. Every cell corridor and chamber held echoes of the day's activities, mingled with the uncertainty of what night might bring. Some prisoners found themselves revisiting decisions, questioning loyalties, or imagining escape routes. Others sank into despair, feeling the weight of countless days and nights compressed into this one relentless moment. The night was a crucible, forging endurance and breaking spirit in equal measure. Within these walls, time was an endless cycle, and every heartbeat marked the intersection of fear, hope, and human perseverance. As the night deepened, the shadows thickened, swallowing the narrow corridors and corners of the prison. The once familiar scent of damp stone and straw grew heavier, more oppressive, mixing with the faint coppery tang of blood from minor scrapes and old wounds. Every inhalation reminded prisoners of their confinement of the walls that hemmed them in and the ceaseless passage of time that pressed upon them like an invisible weight. In this darkness, the prison became a living entity, stone and mortar transformed into a predator patient and observant feeding on the unease of those trapped within. From the cells came whispers, soft and cautious, barely audible over the rustle of rats and the drip of water. These whispers carried stories, warnings, and scraps of news, a lifeline connecting isolated souls. A man huddled in a corner murmured to his neighbor about a farmer's market beyond the town walls, describing the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter. A fleeting memory that seemed almost otherworldly in the starkness of his surroundings. Another recounted a tale of a river, its banks lined with reeds, where he once fished as a boy. Each story was a thread of human experience, fragile yet essential, weaving connections in a place designed to strip identity and hope. Yet not all whispers were benign. Suspicion and fear colored conversations as prisoners learned that alliances could shift in a heartbeat. A careless word, a glance misunderstood, or a rumor about informants could ignite mistrust, sometimes leading to quiet confrontations in the shadows. Here, the night amplified human instincts, paranoia, loyalty, and survival, forcing prisoners to navigate not only the dangers of the stone walls, but the intricate, invisible networks of social tension. Every relationship, every secret became a strategy, a tool for endurance. The cold crept steadily upward from the stone floors, seeping into joints and muscles, gnawing at endurance. Those in thin clothing shivered, hugging themselves for warmth, while others rolled tightly in straw mats or scraps of fabric scavenged from the day. Fire was a rare luxury, often only a torch at the far end of a corridor, casting limited light and little heat. Hunger, though muted after the day's meager meal, lingered as a hollow ache, intensifying discomfort and fraying patience. The combination of cold, fatigue, and hunger made every sound and movement feel more pronounced, every shadow more menacing. In the silent stretches of the night, prisoners faced the haunting specter of their own thoughts. Memories became vivid and sometimes cruel, the mind embellishing regrets and fears. Some recalled family, the warmth of hearth and home, the laughter of children, or the touch of a loved one. These recollections were bittersweet, offering temporary solace while simultaneously highlighting the chasm between the outside world and their current existence. Others were consumed by the reality of crime punishment or injustice that had led them here, replaying events over and over, seeking meaning, explanation, or redemption. Isolation in darkness tested the limits of sanity. Men and women shackled or confined discovered the elasticity of the human mind, how it could stretch to imagine freedom, or shrink under pressure to inhabit the tiniest corners of despair. Sleep was fleeting and often filled with nightmares or imagined threats. A sudden clang or distant footstep jolted hearts and bodies alike. Eyes accustomed to the dim light of torches or moon filtering through narrow windows could detect movement imperceptible in daylight, creating illusions of looming figures or shifting shapes. Fear was constant, yet invisible, a companion as reliable as any guard. Amid the uncertainty, some prisoners found rhythm and ritual. Scraping straw into neat piles, tracing invisible lines on stone floors, or repeating whispered prayers became anchors in the relentless night. These small acts created a sense of agency in an environment designed to obliterate autonomy. They were declarations of present statements that despite chains and walls, life endured. The mind and body clung to these rituals, finding a semblance of control where none truly existed. The distant toll of a bell from the town outside marked the passage of time, though it was meaningless in the context of the night's long stretch. Inside hours blurred into one another, measured only by personal endurance and the slow, inexorable crawl of the darkness. Some prisoners conversed, huddled for warmth or companionship. Others remained silent, absorbing the weight of the stone walls in solitary contemplation. The prison was both cage and theater, a space where human behavior unfolded in its rawest form, illuminated not by light, but by the interplay of fear, hope, and survival instinct. Not all shadows were menacing. Occasionally, a prisoner's quiet laughter broke the monotony, a small rebellion against despair. Some recounted stories of past glories, of festivals, harvests, or victories that now seemed remote. Even in their diminished circumstances, moments of levity flickered like candle flames, brief and delicate, yet sustaining. These acts reminded prisoners of the life beyond the walls of the identity that remained unbroken by chains or stone. Yet the night was relentless, and the tranquility always fragile. Sudden noises, a loose stone falling, a door slammed in the distance, could shatter even the most carefully constructed mental defenses. Some experienced hallucinations, shadows taking forms, walls breathing, or the sound of voices not there. These illusions, born of fear and sensory deprivation, were a testament to the toll exacted by confinement and darkness. The night was a crucible, revealing the strengths and vulnerabilities of the human spirit alike. As dawn approached, the first hints of light began to filter into the high windows, softening shadows, but doing little to alleviate the weight of the night. The prisoners, though exhausted and frayed, sensed the end of this particular trial. Yet in their bones, they knew the day would bring its own hardships, labor, scrutiny, hunger, and punishment. The night behind stone walls had tested endurance, sharpened fears, and illuminated the depths of human resilience. They had survived the dark hours, but survival was only a prelude to another cycle, another relentless day in the prison's grip. The night revealed a stark truth. While stone could imprison the body, the mind was both sanctuary and battlefield. Every prisoner had navigated this terrain differently, some with courage, others with despair, but all were marked by the experience. The darkness had exposed fragility and resilience in equal measure, teaching lessons no daylight could convey. In the stillness, prisoners had learned to listen, to wait, and to endure. And as the first pale light of morning touched the walls, they readied themselves to face once more the unyielding rhythm of confinement. The first light of dawn crept over the jagged battlements, brushing the cold stone walls with a muted glow. It was a gentle illumination, almost tender, yet it carried no promise of relief. Inside the prison, the air remained thick with the remnants of the night, the damp, the staleness, the faint, lingering odors of decay and human suffering. Some prisoners stirred reluctantly, shifting against the hardness of stone floors and the scratchy straw that served as bedding. The awakening was quiet, tentative, as if any sudden movement might summon the attention of a guard, or worse, a punishment. Through the narrow slits in the walls, pale shafts of light highlighted the contours of worn faces, etched with lines of despair and endurance. Eyes adjusted slowly, scanning their surroundings, noting the faint movements of neighbors, a man stretching stiff limbs, a woman wiping a hand across a grimy cheek, a boy clinging to the blanket for warmth. Each movement was deliberate, measured in intimate choreography performed in the shadows of captivity. These morning rituals were subtle declarations of life, a small defiant insistence that the soul remained intact even when the body was confined. The prison was awakening as an organism, each cell a vein, each corridor a channel through which tension and fear circulated. The clang of iron doors echoed softly, a reminder of boundaries, of separation of power, concentrated in the hands of those who controlled them. Guards emerged from hidden chambers, their boots sounding heavy and deliberate on stone floors, eyes scanning, inspecting, asserting authority. Prisoners shifted nervously, shoulders, hunched backs pressed to the walls, faces shadowed in anticipation. Every step, every glance, every gesture carried consequence. Each breath was a negotiation with the weight of oppression. A muted ritual unfolded in the central courtyard. A small group gathered around a trough, waiting for the morning ration. A thin gruel water drawn from the well. A small piece of bread, hardened and dry. The distribution was perfunctory, but deliberate, the smallest detail sufficient to create tension, spark resentment, or cement fragile alliances. Some prisoners clutched their portion protectively, eyes darting toward neighbors who might covet even the tiniest morsel. Others shared cautiously a gesture of survival, understanding that cooperation might secure future reprieve or favor. Hunger sharpened instincts, yet, even in scarcity, human connection found ways to persist. Beyond the courtyard, the prison walls rose like cliffs, encasing the souls within their grasp. Each tower, each arrow, slit, each iron-barred window was a reminder that freedom existed only as a memory, a story, a vision too distant to reach. From these heights, the morning light touched nothing but stone and shadow. Yet it filtered down into the cells, revealing the contours of chains, the roughness of walls, the meager possessions of those confined. Light illuminated the textures of suffering bruises, faintly blue sores crusted with healing, the wear of thin clothing, the rough calluses of hands hardened by labor. It was a visual testament to endurance. Labor awaited those who were able-bodied, an inescapable aspect of existence within the prison. The day demanded effort: stone to be moved, refuse to be cleared, water to be carried, floors to be scrubbed. The rhythm of work imposed structure, a brutal pattern that prevented full despair, but allowed no comfort. Prisoners approached tasks with a mechanical precision, muscles coiled and taut from exhaustion, minds focused on completion. In this repetitive motion, some found a strange solace, a temporary respite from the relentless pressure of their thoughts, a way to measure time, a proof that action could still shape some part of their world. Yet punishment lingered on the edge of each day, a shadow that never fully lifted. A misstep, a whispered word, a glance deemed disrespectful, any act could summon retribution. The guards wielded authority with a quiet ferocity, their presence a constant silent threat. Punishments were varied and calculated, designed to maintain order and assert dominance: the lash, the stocks extended, standing deprivation. Each method reminded prisoners that while dawn brought light, it brought no sanctuary. Survival was a careful balance, a navigation between compliance and resistance, endurance and expression, life, and the ever-present possibility of death. Whispers persisted even as work commenced. Messages slipped from cell to cell, carried by subtle movements or coded gestures. Plans to escape, rumors of events beyond the walls, updates from family members or allies outside these threads wove through the daily fabric, sustaining hope and fueling tension. Night's lessons lingered, reminding prisoners that while darkness held terror, light carried its own tests. Awareness in the day demanded vigilance, caution, and cunning. Each moment was a negotiation. Each glance, an assessment of friend or foe. Each interaction, a measure of potential survival. In corners and cells away from the main courtyard, the infirm and weak began their day under the watchful eyes of caretakers or fellow prisoners. Illness, injuries, and the relentless effects of confinement were as punishing as any labor. Some moved with painful slowness, leaning against walls, or using crude supports fashioned from straw and broken wood. Others waited silently, enduring the morning's harsh light, as their eyes adjusted to the reality that each day could bring small relief or irreversible suffering. Survival in the prison was as much about managing the body as navigating the social landscape. The morning sun, climbing slowly higher, did little to ease the oppressive weight of the prison. Its warmth reached only the edges, touching the shoulders of those working outside, illuminating the texture of stone, the iron bars, the rough fabric of garments. Light became a witness to endurance, recording the subtle victories and minor defeats of a population confined yet resilient. Shadows receded only partially, reminding prisoners that darkness never fully dissipated within these walls, that memory, fear, and anticipation persisted beyond the reach of daylight. By mid-morning, the monotony of work and observation had settled into a rhythm, a fragile and uneasy equilibrium. Prisoners moved through the day as if rehearsing a script that had no ending, a performance dictated by necessity and circumstance. Eyes constantly evaluated the environment, noting openings, vulnerabilities, and threats. Bodies, though tired, responded with practiced efficiency. Minds, though strained, adapted to anticipate every possible scenario. The prison demanded constant vigilance, a relentless engagement with both the material and psychological dimensions of confinement. In these first hours of the day, the lesson of the prison remained clear. Endurance, awareness, and subtle strategy were essential to survival. Each prisoner navigated the endless loop with their own blend of fortitude, cunning, and restraint. The light of dawn illuminated the reality of existence within stone walls, revealing that while imprisonment constrained the body, it could not fully dominate the mind. Each small act, movement, observation, interaction was a testament to human adaptability. The day as yet was only beginning, and the loop of survival would continue. But in the quiet observation of these initial hours, the rhythm of endurance was established, a fragile, delicate pattern that would dictate the pace of every moment to come. The walls, the gates, the shadows, they all bore witness to the human spirit navigating confinement. And as the sun rose higher, prisoners braced themselves for the inevitable continuation of labor scrutiny and the harsh reality of life inside a medieval prison. As the sun climbed further, the light revealed the stark geometry of the prison walls, their rough-hewn stones etched with the marks of centuries. Shadows retreated only to linger in corners, in the spaces beneath doorways, and in the hollow eyes of those who moved cautiously through the corridors. Time here was measured not by hours, but by endurance, the rhythm of labor, the passing of rations, the subtle changes in guard patrols, the faint shifting of air through narrow slits in the walls. Each day was a mirror of the last, and yet every moment bore the possibility of difference. The possibility that some small act might alter fate, if only for a few fleeting hours. Prisoners who had survived the initial hours began to navigate their routines with increasing precision. The infirm and weak were assisted by others' movements slow and deliberate, guided by empathy as much as necessity. Bonds formed quietly in whispered exchanges and shared glances in small acts of kindness that defied the cruelty surrounding them. Even amidst suffering, these connections were vital, a lifeline to sanity in a world dominated by stone iron. and the omnipresent threat of punishment. Cooperation, as much as caution, was a currency of survival. In the courtyard, the distribution of midday rations became an event fraught with tension. Thin gruel and stale bread changed hands quickly, accompanied by cautious glances and measured words. Some prisoners, stronger or more assertive, claimed their share immediately, while others waited their turn, hoping that the rhythm of the guard's attention might allow for discreet sharing or subtle negotiation. Hunger was constant gnawing at bodies weakened by labor, but it also sharpened the mind, forcing adaptability and cunning. The struggle for sustenance was both physical and psychological, a reminder that survival required strategy as well as stamina. Labor continued through the mid-morning into afternoon, and the rhythm of the day settled into a pattern work. Vigilance, observation, and the careful negotiation of social dynamics within the prison. Each prisoner became attuned to subtle cues, the positioning of a guard's shadow, the slight turn of a fellow prisoner's head, the sound of keys jingling from distant corridors. Every movement was scrutinized, every pause calculated. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, absorbing sound and motion, a living entity that both constrained and observed. Within this rhythm, the human mind adapted, finding small avenues of control in a space defined by confinement. The heat of the day intensified the hardships. Stone floors radiated warmth, yet the air within the corridors remained damp and cold, a paradox that exacerbated discomfort. Laborers moved stones, carried water, and scrubbed floors, their muscles taut with fatigue, their breath forming faint clouds in the cold pockets of air. Even as the sun offered illumination, it could not banish the oppressive weight of the prison. In these hours, endurance became ritualized, each motion a meditation on survival, each breath a quiet testament to resilience. Prisoners, in the shadows of the infirmary or makeshift infirmary spaces, struggled against pain, illness, and exhaustion. Some murmured prayers, others remained silent, gazing at the walls, imagining freedom beyond the thick stones and iron bars. Memory became both comfort and torment, visions of a world outside of family, of open skies, were constant companions, simultaneously sustaining and reminding of absence. In these private moments, the psychological toll of imprisonment revealed itself fully, a constant negotiation between hope and despair, between acceptance and resistance. As the afternoon waned, whispers resumed among prisoners. Plans, rumors, and small acts of rebellion circulated subtly, a quiet undercurrent beneath the visible rhythm of labor and observation. Alliances formed and shifted with ease. Trust was measured in small increments. These interactions, though minor in appearance, were significant. They represented control agency and the assertion of human will in a place designed to strip both away. For some, these moments were lifelines. For others, they were reminders of vulnerability, of the precariousness of existence in the stone-bound world. Evening approached slowly, a transition marked less by light than by a subtle shift in energy. Guards' patrols adjusted, and the shadows deepened, creating a landscape of partial concealment and partial exposure. Prisoners moved with quiet efficiency, tending to chores, securing bedding, and preparing for the night. Conversations dwindled, replaced by the hum of tension, anticipation, and fatigue. In these final hours, the full weight of the day's endurance pressed down. Every joint, every muscle, every nerve had been tested. The mind, though resilient, carried the cumulative strain of fear, labor, and deprivation. Night fell, fully bringing with it a profound, almost tangible silence, broken only by distant noises, the rattle of chains, the creak of doors, the sigh of a guard. Shadows merged into a single, encompassing darkness revealing how thin the veil between life and death could be within these walls. Sleep was elusive, offering brief respite but never complete escape. Prisoners lay on straw or stone bodies curled defensively, minds alert to the slightest disruption. The night was both a reprieve and a trial, a time when fear of the unseen became palpable and imagination could conjure horrors as vivid as reality. In these hours, reflection became unavoidable. Prisoners contemplated the loop of existence within the prison, the repetition of labor rations, scrutiny, and suffering. Some recounted memories of freedom of times before captivity, imagining places they might never see again. Others plotted considered strategies for escape, or simply endured waiting for the dawn that would begin the cycle anew. This reflection, though internal, was shared invisibly, linking prisoners across cells, across corridors, through the common experience of endurance. As the night deepened, the first hints of dawn began to appear, once more pale light brushing against the stone, foreshadowing the repetition of the cycle. The prison remained unchanged in structure, but in its occupants, subtle transformations had occurred. The strong had endured, the weak had been assisted, alliances had shifted, and the mind had adapted to the unyielding rhythm. The endless loop continued, but within it lay the seeds of resilience, ingenuity, and survival. In the quiet final moments before day fully returned, the prisoners collectively embodied the essence of endurance. They were living proofs that even in the most confined, oppressive circumstances, the human spirit could persist, adapt, and find avenues for hope. Some would awaken with renewed determination, others with weary resignation. Some might not awaken at all. Yet each life, each breath, each small act of defiance or cooperation was a testament to existence within the cold embrace of medieval imprisonment. The sun finally touched the outermost stones with warmth and light, signaling the inevitable repetition. Prisoners braced themselves, understanding that another day would bring the same demands, the same fears, the same small victories and losses. And yet, within this repetition, they carried a fragile, enduring truth: survival was not only possible, but an ongoing assertion of human resilience. The gates remained closed, the walls still thick, and the loop unbroken, but inside life persisted vivid and determined. The day would begin again. Labor, scrutiny, whispers, endurance, reflection. The rhythm of imprisonment continued, ceaseless and exacting. And though the gates remained iron-bound and the walls cold and unyielding, the human spirit persisted, each heartbeat, a quiet declaration that confinement could not fully extinguish life, hope, or dignity. The story of a day inside a medieval prison ended not with freedom, but with endurance. A testimony to the quiet, persistent strength of those who lived, suffered, and survived within stone and iron. Step with me through the heavy, iron-bound gates of a medieval prison, where stone walls breathe the weight of centuries and shadows cling to every corner. Here time does not march. It lingers, stretches, and twists, measured only by the rhythm of labor, the creak of chains, the quiet fear of those who live and endure within these walls. This is a world without reprieve, where survival is not guaranteed. And yet, even amidst the darkness, human resilience shines in the smallest gestures: a shared morsel of bread, a whispered word of hope, a secret glance across a damp corridor. In this place, every day is a test. The warden's steps echo like a drumbeat of authority, the clatter of keys, a reminder that freedom is a distant memory. Hunger gnaws labor, punishes, and disease waits silently in the shadows. Yet prisoners endure. They adapt. They find strength in one another, forming bonds that defy the cruelty around them. Through whispered stories, hidden knowledge and subtle defiance, life persists. It is a testament not only to survival, but to the indomitable spirit of those who lived in a world where every sunrise promised the same harsh reality as the day before. As we walk these corridors, witness the flickering torches against cold stone, and feel the oppressive air, we see history not as a distant story, but as lived experience. These walls have heard the sighs of despair, the murmurs of resilience, and the quiet triumphs of ingenuity and courage. Each chained prisoner, each laboring soul, carries a story of endurance, an echo that reaches across centuries, reminding us of the fragility and yet astonishing strength of human life under confinement. If you have walked these halls with us, felt the tension and the fleeting moments of hope, then you understand why history is more than dates and names. It is the lived, breathing reality of those who came before us. Their struggles, their strategies, and their courage are lessons in resilience, patience, and the relentless pursuit of life, even when it seems all is lost. If this journey into the shadows of medieval life has stirred your imagination, your empathy, or your curiosity, honor it by sharing these stories. Like, subscribe, and join us as we continue to explore history through the eyes of those who lived it, suffered it, and survived it. Every click, every share helps bring their world to life, preserving the echoes of the past and illuminating the lessons of endurance that still resonate today. Step forward, witness, and remember. History is not only to be learned, it is to be felt.